After no more than 10 minutes, they heard the Scandinavian stride off down the corridor, a walking testimonial to the establishment and the health resort, and the Russian mother was admitted with her Sasha. Both times, as the door opened, Hans Castorp observed that it was half dark in the X-ray room. An artificial twilight prevailed there, as in Dr. Krokowski's analytic cabinet. The windows were shrouded, daylight shut out, and 2 electric lights were burning. But as Sasha and his mother went in, and Hans Castorp gazed after them, the corridor door opened, and the next patient entered the waiting room. She was, of course, too early, on account of the delay in the laboratory.
It was Madame Chowchat.
It was Claudia Chowchat who appeared thus suddenly in the little waiting room. Hans Castorp recognized her, staring-eyed, and distinctly felt the blood leave his cheeks. His jaw relaxed, his mouth was on the point of falling open. Her entrance had taken place so casually, so unforeseen. She had not been there, and then, all at once, there she was, and sharing these narrow quarters with the cousins. Joachim flung a quick glance at Hans Castorp, afterwards not only casting down his eyes, but taking up again the illustrated sheet he had laid aside, and burying his face in it. Hans Castorp could not summon resolution to do the same. He grew very red after his sudden pallor, and his heart pounded. Frau Chowchat seated herself by the laboratory door, in a little round easy chair with stumpy, as it were rudimentary arms. She leaned back, crossed one leg lightly over the other, and stared into space. She knew she was being looked at, and her Pribislav eyes shifted their gaze nervously, almost squinting. She wore a white sweater and blue skirt, and had a book from the lending library in her lap. She tapped softly with the sole of the foot that rested on the floor. After a minute and a half, she changed her position, looked round, stood up, with an air of not knowing what she was to do or where to go, and began to speak. She was asking something. She addressed a question to Joachim, though he sat there apparently deep in his magazine, while Hans Castorp was doing nothing at all. She shaped the words with her lips and gave them voice out of her white throat. It was the voice, not deep, but with the slightest edge, and pleasantly husky, that Hans Castorp knew, had known so long ago and yet heard so lately swing. With pleasure, only you must be sure to give it me back after the lesson. Those words had been uttered clearly and fluently. These came rather hesitatingly and brokenly. The speaker had no native right to them. She only borrowed them, as Hans Castorp had heard her do before, when he experienced the mingled feeling of superiority and ecstasy we have described. One hand in her sweater pocket, the other at the back of her head, Frau Chowchat asked, "May I ask for what time you had an appointment?" And Joachim, with a quick look at his cousin, answered, drawing his heels together as he sat, "For 3:30. She spoke again. "Mine was for 3:45. "What is it then? It is nearly 4. Some people just entered, did they not?" "Yes, 2 people. They were ahead of us. There seems to be some delay. Everything is a half-hour late." "It is disagreeable," she said, nervously touching her hair. "Rather," responded Joachim. "We have been waiting nearly half an hour already." Thus they conversed, and Hans Castorp listened as in a dream. For his cousin to speak to Frau Chowchat was almost the same as his doing it himself, and yet how altogether different. That rather had affronted him. It sounded odd and brusque, if not worse, in view of the circumstances. To think that Joachim could speak to her like that, to think that he could speak to her at all. And very likely he prided himself on his pert rather. Much as Hans Castorp had played up before Joachim and set him Brini when he was asked how long he meant to stay, and answered, 3 weeks. It was to Joachim, though he had the paper in front of his nose, that she had turned with her question, because he was the older inhabitant, of course, whom she had known longer by sight, but perhaps for another reason as well, because they too might meet on a conventional footing and carry on an ordinary conversation in articulate words, because nothing wild and deep, mysterious and terrifying, held sway between them. Had it been somebody brown-eyed, with a ruby ring and orange perfume, who sat here waiting with them, it would have been his, Hans Castorp's, part to lead the conversation and say, rather in the purity and detachment of his sentiments, "Yes, madam." Certainly rather unpleasant, he would have said, and might have taken his handkerchief out of his breast pocket with a flourish and blown his nose. "Have patience. Our case is no better than yours." How surprised Joachim would have been at his fluency, but without seriously wishing himself in Hans Castorp's place. No, and Hans Castorp was not jealous of Joachim for being able to talk to Frau Chauchat. He was satisfied that she should have addressed herself to his cousin. It showed that she recognized the situation for what it was. His heart pounded. After Joachim's cavalier treatment of Madame Chauchat, in which Hans Castorp seemed to savor something almost like faint hostility on his cousin's part toward their fair fellow patient, a hostility at which he could not help smiling, despite the commotion in his mind, Claudia tried to turn up and down the room. Then, finding the space too confined, she too took up an illustrated paper and returned to the easy chair with the rudimentary arms. Hans Castorp looked at her, with his chin in his collar, like his grandfather. It was laughable to see how like the old man he looked. Frau Chauchat had crossed one leg over the other again, and her knee, even the whole slender line of the thigh, showed beneath the blue skirt. She was only of middle height, a thoroughly proper and delightful height, in Hans Castorp's eyes, but relatively long-legged and narrow in the hips. She sat leaning forward, with her crossed forearms supported on her knee, her shoulders drooping, and her back rounded, so that the neck bone stuck out prominently, and nearly the whole spine was marked out under the close-fitting sweater. Her breasts, which were not high and voluptuous like Marusha's, but small and maidenly, were pressed together from both sides. Hans Castorp recalled, suddenly, that she too was sitting here waiting to be x-rayed. The Hofrat painted her. He reproduced her outward form with oil and colors upon the canvas. And now, in the twilight room, he would direct upon her the rays which would reveal to him the inside of her body. When this idea occurred to Hans Castorp, he turned away his head and put on a primly detached air. A sort of seemly obscurantism presented itself to him as the only correct attitude in the presence of such a thought. The waiting together in the little room did not last for long. They evidently gave rather short shrift to Sasha and his mother in their effort to make up for lost time. The technician in his white smock once more appeared. Joachim stood up and tossed his paper back onto the table, and Hans Castorp, not without inward hesitation, followed him to the open door. He was struggling with chivalrous scruples, also with the temptation to put himself, after all, upon conventional terms with Frau Chauchat, to speak to her and offer her precedence, in French, if he could manage. Hastily, he sought to muster the words, the sentence structure. But he did not know if such courtesies were practiced up here. Probably the established order was more powerful than the rules of chivalry. Joachim must know, and as he made no motion to defer to sex, even though Hans Castorp looked at him imploringly, the latter followed his cousin past Frau Chauchat, who merely glanced up from her stooping posture as they went through the door into the laboratory. He was too much possessed by the events of the last 10 minutes and by what he left behind, for his mind to pass immediately with his body over the threshold of the X-ray laboratory. He saw nothing, or only vaguely, in the artificially lighted room. He still heard Frau Chauchat's pleasantly veiled voice, with which she had said, "What is it then? Some people have just gone in. It is disagreeable." The sound of it still shivered sweetly down his back. He saw the shape of her knee under the cloth skirt, saw the bone of her neck, under the short reddish-blonde hairs that were not gathered up into the braids, and again the shiver ran down his back. Then he saw Hofrat Behrens, with his back to them, standing before a sort of built-in recess, looking at a black plate which he held at arm's length toward the dim light in the ceiling. They passed him and went on into the room, followed by the assistant, who made preparations to dispatch their affair. It smelled very odd in here. The air was filled with a sort of stale ozone. The built-in structure, projecting between the two black-hung windows, divided the room into two unequal parts. Hans Castorp could distinguish physical apparatus. Lenses, switchboards, towering measuring instruments, a box like a camera on a rolling stand, glass diapositives in rows set in the walls. Hard to say whether this was a photographic studio, a dark room, or an inventor's workshop and technological witch's kitchen. Joachim had begun, without more ado, to lay bare the upper half of his body. The helper, a square-built, rosy-cheeked young native in a white smock, motioned Hans Castorp to do the same. It went fast, and he was next in turn. As Hans Castorp took off his waistcoat, Behrens came out of the smaller recess where he had been standing into the larger one. "Hello," said he. "Here are our Dioscuri, Castor, and Pollux. If you feel any inclination to blub, kindly suppress it. Just wait. We shall soon see through you both. I expect, Castorp, you feel a little nervous about exposing your inner self to our gaze? Don't be alarmed. We preserve all the amenities. Look here, have you seen my picture gallery?" He led Hans Castorp by the arm before the rows of dark plates on the wall and turned on a light behind them. Hans Castorp saw various members: hands, feet, knee pans, thigh and leg bones, arms and pelvises. But the rounded living form of these portions of the human body was vague and shadowy, like a pale and misty envelope, within which stood out the clear, sharp nucleus, the skeleton. "Very interesting," said Hans Castorp. "Interesting sure enough," responded the Hofrat. "Useful object lesson for the young. X-ray anatomy, triumph of the age. There is a female arm. You can tell by its delicacy. That's what they put around you when they make love, He laughed, and his upper lip with the close-cropped mustache went up still more on one side. The pictures faded. Hans Castorp turned his attention to the preparations for taking Joachim's X-ray. It was done in front of that structure on the other side of which Hofrat Behrens had been standing when they entered. Joachim had taken his place on a sort of shoemaker's bench, in front of a board, which he embraced with his arms and pressed his breast against it, while the assistant improved the position, massaging his back with kneading motions and putting his arms further forward. Then he went behind the camera and stood just as a photographer would, legs apart and stooped over, to look inside. He expressed his satisfaction and, going back to Joachim, warned him to draw in his breath and hold it until all was over. Joachim's rounded back expanded and so remained. The assistant, at the switchboard, pulled the handle. Now, for the space of 2 seconds, fearful powers were in play. Streams of thousands, of 100,000 volts, Hans Castorp seemed to recall, which were necessary to pierce through solid matter. They could hardly be confined to their office. They tried to escape through other outlets. There were explosions like pistol shots, blue sparks on the measuring apparatus. Long lightnings crackled along the walls. Somewhere in the room appeared a red light, like a threatening eye, and a file in Joachim's rear filled with green. Then everything grew quiet, the phenomena disappeared, and Joachim let out his breath with a sigh. It was over. "Next delinquent," said the Hofrat, and nudged Hans Castorp with his elbow. "Don't pretend you're too tired. You'll get a free copy, Castorp. Then you can project the secrets of your bosom on the wall for your children and grandchildren to see." Joachim had stepped down. The technician changed the plate. Hofrat Behrens personally instructed the novice how to sit and hold himself. "Put your arms about it," he said. "Embrace the board. Pretend it's something else, if you like. Press your breast against it, as though it filled you with rapture. Like that. Draw a deep breath. Hold it," he commanded. "Now, please." Hans Castorp waited, blinking, his lungs distended. Behind him the storm broke loose. It crackled, lightened, detonated, and grew still. The lens had looked into his inside. He got down, dazed and bewildered, notwithstanding he had not been physically sensible of the penetration in the slightest degree. "Good lad," said the Hofrat. "Now we shall see." The experienced Joachim had already moved over toward the entrance door and taken position at a stand. At his back was the lofty structure of the apparatus, with a bulb half full of water and distillation tubes. In front of him, breast high, hung a framed screen on pulleys. On his left, between switchboard and instrumentarium, was a red globe. The Hofrat, bestriding a stool in front of the screen, lighted the light. The ceiling light went out, and only the red glow illumined the scene. Then the master turned this too off, with a quick motion, and thick darkness enveloped the laboratory. "We must first accustom the eyes," the Hofrat was heard to say. in the darkness. We must get big pupils, like a cat's, to see what we want to see. You understand, our everyday eyesight would not be good enough for our purposes. We have to banish the bright daylight and its pretty pictures out of our minds. Naturally, said Hans Castorp. He stood at the Hofrat's shoulder and closed his eyes, since the darkness was so profound that it did not matter whether he had them open or shut. First, we must wash our eyes with darkness to see what we want to see. That is plain. I find it quite right and proper, as a matter of fact, that we should collect ourselves a little, beforehand, in silent prayer, as it were. I am standing here with my eyes shut, and have quite a pleasant sleepy feeling. But what is it I smell? Oxygen, said the Hofrat. What you notice in the air is oxygen. Atmospheric product of our little private thunderstorm, you know. Eyes open, he commanded. The magicking is about to begin. Hans Castorp hastened to obey. They heard a switch go on. A motor started up and sang furiously higher and higher until another switch controlled and steadied it. The floor shook with an even vibration. The little red light, at right angles to the ceiling, looked threateningly across at them. Somewhere lightning flashed, and with a milky gleam a window of light emerged from the darkness. It was the square hanging screen, before which Hofrat Behrens bestrode his stool, his legs sprawled apart with his fists supported on them, his blunt nose close to the pane, which gave him a view of a man's interior organism. "Do you see it, young man?" he asked. Hans Castorp leaned over his shoulder, but then raised his head again to look toward the spot where Joachim's eyes were presumably gazing in the darkness, with the gentle, sad expression they had worn during the other examination. "May I?" he asked. "Of course," Joachim replied magnanimously. Out of the dark, and to the pulsation of the floor, and the snapping and cracking of the forces at play, Hans Castorp peered through the lighted window, peered into Joachim Ziemson's empty skeleton. The breastbone and spine fell together in a single dark column. The frontal structure of the ribs was cut across by the paler structure of the back. Above, the collarbones branched off on both sides, and the framework of the shoulder, with the joint and the beginning of Joachim's arm, showed sharp and bare through the soft envelope of flesh. The thoracic cavity was light, but blood vessels were to be seen, some dark spots, a blackish shadow. "Clear picture," said the Hofrat. "Quite a decent leanness. That's the military youth. I've had paunches here. You couldn't see through them, hardly recognize a thing. The rays are yet to be discovered that will go through such layers of fat. This is nice, clean work. Do you see the diaphragm?" he asked, and indicated with his finger the dark arch in the window, that rose and fell. "Do you see the bulges here on the left side, the little protuberances? That was the inflammation of the pleura he had when he was 15 years old. Breathe deep," he commanded.
Deeper.
"Deep, I tell you." And Joachim's diaphragm rose quivering, as high as it could. The upper parts of the lungs could be seen to clear up, but the Hofrat was not satisfied. "Not good enough," he said. "Can you see the Hillou's glands? Can you see the adhesions? Look at the cavities here. That is where the toxins come from that fuddle him." But Hans Castorp's attention was taken up by something like a bag, a strange animal shape, darkly visible behind the middle column, or more on the right side of it, the spectator's right. It expanded and contracted regularly, a little after the fashion of a swimming jellyfish. "Look at his heart," and the Hofrat lifted his huge hand again from his thigh and pointed with his forefinger at the pulsating shadow. Good God, it was the heart, it was Joachim's honor-loving heart, that Hans Castorp saw. "I am looking at your heart," he said in a suppressed voice. "Go ahead," answered Joachim again. Probably he smiled politely up there in the darkness. But the Hofrat told him to be quiet and not betray any sensibility. Behrens studied the spots and the lines, the black festoon in the intercostal space, while Hans Castorp gazed without wearying at Joachim's graveyard shape and bony tenement, this lean memento mori, this scaffolding for mortal flesh to hang on. "Yes, yes. I see," he said, several times over. "My God, I see." He had heard of a woman, a long-dead member of the Tianapel connection, who had been endowed or afflicted with a heavy gift, which she bore in all humility, namely, that the skeletons of persons about to die would appear before her. Thus now Hans Castorp was privileged to behold the good Joachim, but with the aid and under the auspices of physical science, and by his cousin's express permission, so that it was quite legitimate and without gruesome significance. Yet a certain sympathy came over him with the melancholy destiny of his clairvoyant relative. He was strongly moved by what he saw, or more precisely, by the fact that he saw it, and felt stirrings of uneasy doubt as to whether it was really permissible and innocent to stand here in the quaking, crackling darkness and gaze like this. His itch to commit the indiscretion conflicted in his bosom with religious emotion and feelings of concern. But a few minutes later he himself stood in the pillory, in the midst of the electrical storm, while Joachim, his body closed up again, put on his clothes. Again the Hofrat peered through the milky glass, this time into Hans Castorp's own inside, and from his half-utterances, his broken phrases and bursts of scolding, the young man gathered that what he saw corresponded to his expectations. He was so kind as to permit the patient, at his request, to look at his own hand through the screen. And Hans Castorp saw, precisely what he must have expected, but what it is hardly permitted man to see, and what he had never thought it would be vouchsafed him to see. He looked into his own grave. The process of decay was forestalled by the powers of the light ray. The flesh in which he walked disintegrated, annihilated, dissolved in vacant mist, and there within it was the finely turned skeleton of his own hand, the seal ring he had inherited from his grandfather hanging loose and black on the joint of his ring finger, a hard, material object with which man adorns the body that is fated to melt away beneath it, when it passes on to another flesh that can wear it for yet a little while. With the eyes of his Tianapel ancestress, penetrating, prophetic eyes, he gazed at this familiar part of his own body, and for the first time in his life, he understood that he would die. At the thought there came over his face the expression it usually wore when he listened to music, a little dull, sleepy, and pious, his mouth half open, his head inclined toward the shoulder. The Hofrat said, "Spooky what?" "Yes, there's something distinctly spooky about it." He closed off the current. The floor ceased to vibrate, the lightnings to play. The magic window was quenched in darkness. The ceiling light came on. As Hans Castorp flung on his clothes, the Hofrat gave the two young men the results of his observations, in non-technical language, out of regard for their lay minds. It seemed that in Hans Castorp's case, the test of the eye confirmed that of the ear in a way to add luster to science. The Hofrat had seen the old as well as the fresh spots, and strands ran from the bronchial tubes rather far into the organ itself, strands with nodules. Hans Castorp would be able to see for himself later, in the diapositive which they would give him for his very own. The word of command was calm, patience, manly self-discipline, measure, eat, lie down, wake, and drink tea. They left. Hans Castorp, going out behind Joachim, looked over his shoulder. Ushered in by the technician, Frau Chauchat was entering the laboratory. Freedom. How did it seem now to our young Hans Castorp? Was it as though the 7 weeks which, demonstrably and without the shadow of a doubt, he had spent with them up here, were only 7 days? Or, on the contrary, did they seem much longer than had actually been the case? He asked himself, inwardly, and also by way of asking Joachim, but he could not decide. Both were probably true. When he looked back, the time seemed both unnaturally long and unnaturally short, or rather it seemed anything but what it actually was, in saying which we assume that time is a natural phenomenon, and that it is admissible to associate with it the conception of actuality. At all events October was before the door. It might enter any day. The calculation was an easy one for Hans Castorp to make, and he gathered the same result from the conversation of his fellow patients. "Do you know that in 5 days it will be the first again?" he heard Hermine Kleefeld say to two of her familiars, the student Rasmussen and the thick-lipped young man, whose name was Ganser. It was after luncheon, and the guests lingered chatting in the dining room, though the air was heavy with the odors of the meal just served, instead of going into the afternoon rest cure. "The 1st of October, I saw it on the calendar in the office. That makes the second of its kind I've spent in the pleasure resort. Well, summer is over, and so far as there has been a summer, that is, it has really been a cell, like life in general." She shook her head, fetched a sigh from her one lung, and rolled up to the ceiling her dull and stolid eyes. "Cheer up, Rasmussen," she said, and slapped her comrade on the drooping shoulder. "Make a few jokes." "I don't know many," he responded, letting his hands flap fin-like before his breast. "And those I do I can't tell. I'm so tired all the time." "Not even a dog," Ganser said through his teeth, "would want to live longer, if he had to live like this." They laughed and shrugged their shoulders. Settembrini had been standing near them, his toothpick between his lips. As they went out, he said to Hans Castorp, "Don't you believe them, engineer. Never believe them when they grumble. They all do it, without exception, and all of them are only too much at home up here. They lead a loose and idle life, and imagine themselves entitled to pity and justified of their bitterness, irony, and cynicism." "This pleasure resort," she said. "Well, isn't it a pleasure resort then? In my humble opinion it is, and in a very questionable sense too. So life is a cell, up here at this pleasure resort. But once let them go down below, and their manner of life will be such as to leave no doubt that they mean to come back again. Irony, forsooth. Guard yourself, engineer, from the sort of irony that thrives up here. Guard yourself altogether from taking on their mental attitude. Where irony is not a direct and classic device of oratory, not for a moment equivocal to a healthy mind, it makes for depravity. It becomes a drawback to civilization, an unclean traffic with the forces of reaction, vice, and materialism. As the atmosphere in which we live is obviously very favorable to such miasmic growths, I may hope, or rather, I must fear, that you understand my meaning." Truly, the Italian's words were of the sort that 7 weeks ago, down in the flatland, would have been empty sound to Hans Castorp's ears. But his stay up here had made his mind receptive to them, receptive in the sense that he comprehended them with his mind, if not with his sympathies, which would have meant even more. For although he was at bottom glad that Settembrini, after all that had passed, continued, as he did, still to talk to him, admonishing, instructing, seeking to establish an influence upon his mind, yet his understanding had reached the point where he was critical of the Italian's words, and at times, up to a point, withheld his assent. "Imagine," he said to himself, "he talks about irony just as he does about music. He'll soon be telling us that it is politically suspect, that is, from the moment it ceases to be a direct and classic device of oratory. But irony, that is not for a moment equivocal. What kind of irony would that be, I should like to ask, if I may make so bold as to put in my oar? It would be a piece of dried-up pedantry. Thus ungrateful is immature youth. It takes all that is offered, and bites the hand that feeds it." But it would have seemed too risky to put his opposition into words. He confined himself to commenting upon what Herr Settembrini had said about Hermine Kleefeld, which he found ungenerous, or rather, had his reasons for wishing to find it so. "But the girl is ill," he said. "She is seriously ill, without the shadow of a doubt. She has every reason for pessimism. What do you expect of her?" "Disease and despair," Settembrini said, "are often only forms of depravity." "And Leopardi," thought Hans Castorp, who definitely despaired of science and progress. "And our schoolmaster himself? He is infected too and keeps coming back here, and Carducci would have had small joy of him." Aloud he said, "You are good. Why, the girl may lie down and die any day, and you call it depravity. You'll have to make that a little clearer. If you said that illness is sometimes a consequence of depravity, that would at least be sensible." "Very sensible indeed," Settembrini put in. "My word. So, if I stopped at that, you would be satisfied. Or, if you said that illness may serve as a pretext for depravity, that would be all right too." "Grazie tanto. But illness a form of depravity? That is to say, not originating in depravity, but itself depravity? That seems to me a paradox." "I beg of you, engineer, not to impute to me anything of the sort. I despise paradoxes, I hate them. All that I said to you about irony, I would say over again about paradoxes, and more besides. Paradox is the poisonous flower of quietism, the iridescent surface of the rotting mind, the greatest depravity of all. Moreover, I note that you are once more defending disease." "No, what you are saying interests me. It reminds me of things Dr. Krokowski says in his Monday lectures. He too explains organic disease as a secondary phenomenon. Scarcely the pure idealist. What have you against him? Just that. You are down on analysis? Not always. I am for it and against it both by turns. How am I to understand that? Analysis as an instrument of enlightenment and civilization is good, insofar as it shatters absurd convictions, acts as a solvent upon natural prejudices, and undermines authority. Good, in other words, in that it sets free, refines, humanizes, makes slaves ripe for freedom. But it is bad, very bad, insofar as it stands in the way of action, cannot shape the vital forces, maims life at its roots. Analysis can be a very unappetizing affair, as much so as death, with which it may well belong, allied to the grave and its unsavory anatomy. Well roared, lion, Castorp could not help thinking, as he often did when his Settembrini delivered himself of something pedagogic. Aloud, he only said, "We've been having to do with X-ray anatomy in these days, down on the lower floor. Behrens called it that, when he X-rayed us." "Oh, so you have made that stage too? Well, I saw the skeleton of my hand," Hans Castorp said, and sought to call up the feeling that had mounted in him at the sight. "Did you get them to show you yours?" "No, I don't take the faintest interest in my skeleton." "But what was the physician's verdict?" "He saw strands with nodules." "The scoundrel! I have heard you call Hofrat Behrens that before her Settembrini."
What do you mean by it?
"I assure you the epithet was deliberately chosen." "No, her Settembrini, there I find you are unjust. I admit the man has his faults. His manner of speech becomes disagreeable in the long run. There is something forced about it, especially when one remembers he had the great sorrow of losing his wife up here. But what an estimable and meritorious man he is, after all, a benefactor to suffering humanity. I met him the other day coming from an operation, resection of ribs, a matter of life and death, you know. It made a great impression on me to see him fresh from such exacting and splendid work, in which he is so much the master. He was still warm from it, and had lighted a cigar by way of reward. I envied him. That was commendable of you. Well, and your sentence?" "He has not set any definite time." "That is good too. And now let us betake us to our cure engineer. Each to his own place." They parted at the door of number 34. "You are going up to the roof now, Herr Settembrini? It must be more fun to lie in company than alone. Do you talk? Are they pleasant people?" "Oh, they are nothing but Parthians and Scythians." "You mean Russians?" "Russians, male and female," said Settembrini, and the corner of his mouth spanned a little. "Goodbye, engineer." He had said that of malice aforethought, undoubtedly. Hans Castorp walked into his own room in confusion. Was Settembrini aware of his state? Very likely, like the schoolmaster he was, he had been spying on him and seen which way his eyes were going. Hans Castorp was angry with the Italian and also with himself, for having by his lack of self-control invited the thrust. He took up his writing materials to carry them with him into the balcony, for now it was no more use. The letter home, the third letter, must be written, and as he did so, he went on whipping up his anger, muttering to himself about this windbag and logic chopper, who meddled with matters that were no concern of his, and chirruped to the girls in the street. He felt quite disinclined to the effort of writing. The organ grinder had put him off it altogether, with his innuendo. But no matter what his feelings, he must have winter clothing, money, footwear, linen, in brief, everything he might have brought with him had he known he was coming, not for 3 short summer weeks, but for an indefinite stay which was certain to last for a piece into the winter. Or rather, considering the notions about time current up here, was quite likely to last all the winter. It was this he must let them know at home, even if only as a possibility. He must tell the whole story and not put them, or himself, off any longer with pretexts. In this spirit, then, he wrote, practicing the technique he had so often seen Joachim practice, with a fountain pen in his deck chair, with his knees drawn up and the portfolio laid upon them. He wrote upon the letter paper of the establishment, of which he kept a supply in his table drawer, to James Tienapel, who stood closest to him among the 3 uncles, and asked him to pass the news on to the consul. He spoke of an unfortunate occurrence, of suspicions that had proved justified, of the medical opinion that it would be best for him to remain where he was for a part, perhaps for all of the winter, since cases like his often proved more obstinate than those that began more alarmingly, and it was clearly advisable to go after the infection energetically and root it out once for all. From this point of view, he considered, it had been a most fortunate circumstance that he had chanced to come here and been induced to submit to an examination, for otherwise he might have remained for some time in ignorance of his condition and been apprised of it later and more alarmingly. As for the length of time which would probably be required for the cure, they must not be surprised to hear the whole winter might easily slip away before his return. In short, that he might come down hardly earlier than Joachim. Ideas about time were different up here from those ordinarily held about the length of stay at the baths, or at an ordinary cure. The smallest unit of time, so to speak, was the month, and a single month was almost no time at all. The weather was cool. He sat in his overcoat, with a rug about him, and his hands were cold. At times he looked up from the paper which he was covering with these reasonable and sensible phrases. At the landscape now so familiar, he scarcely saw it any more. This extended valley with its retreating succession of peaks at the entrance, they looked pale and glassy today, with its bright and populous floor, which glistened when the sun shone full upon it, and its forest-clad or meadowy slopes, whence came the sound of cowbells. He wrote with growing ease, and wondered why he had dreaded to write. For as he wrote, he felt that nothing could be clearer than his presentation of the matter, and that there was no doubt it would meet with perfect comprehension at home. A young man of his class and circumstances acted for himself when it seemed advisable. He took advantage of the facilities which existed expressly for him and his like. So it was fitting. If he had taken the journey home, they would have made him come back again on hearing his report. He asked them to send what things he needed. And at the end he asked to have money sent. A monthly check of 800 marks would cover everything. He signed his name. It was done. This last letter was exhaustive. It covered the case, not according to the time conceptions of down below, but according to those obtaining up here. It asserted Hans Castorp's freedom. This was his own word, albeit not expressed. He would hardly have shaped the syllables even in his mind, but he felt the full sense of its meaning, as he had come to know it during his stay up here, a sense which had little to do with the Sedumbrinian significance, and his breast was shaken with that excited alarm, which swept over him in a wave, as it had done before. His head was hot with the blood that had gone to it as he wrote. His cheeks burned. He took the thermometer from his lamp-stand and measured, as though to make use of an opportunity. Mercurius had gone up to 100 degrees. Look at that, he thought, and added a postscript to his letter. It did strain me rather, after all, to write this. My temperature is 100 degrees. I see that I must be very quiet for the present. You must excuse me if I don't write often. Then he lay back and held up his hand toward the light, palm outward, as he had held it behind the light screen. But the light of day did not encroach upon its living outline. Rather, it looked more substantial and opaque for its background of bright air. Only its outer edges were rosily illuminated. This was his living hand that he was used to see, to use, to wash, not that uncanny scaffolding which he had beheld through the screen. The analytic grave then opened was closed again. Whims of Mercurius. October began as months do. Their entrance is, in itself, an unostentatious and soundless affair, without outward signs and tokens. They, as it were, steal in softly and, unless you are keeping close watch, escape your notice altogether. Time has no divisions to mark its passage. There is never a thunderstorm or blare of trumpets to announce the beginning of a new month or year. Even when a new century begins, it is only we mortals who ring bells and fire off pistols. To Hans Castorp, the first day of October and the last day of September were as like as two peas. Both were equally cold and unfriendly, and those that followed were the same. In the rest cure one used one's overcoat and both camel's hair rugs, not only in the evening, but in the daytime. The fingers that held the book were stiff and clammy, however the cheeks burned, and Joachim was strongly tempted to resort to his fur sack, but resisted, in order not to pamper himself thus early in the season. Some days later, however, That is, between the beginning and middle of the month, there came another change. A latter summer set in, with amazing splendor. The praises of this mountain October, which Hans Castorp had heard, were not idly sung. For some 2.5 weeks all the glories of heaven reigned over valley and mountain. One day outvied another in blueness and clarity, and the sun burned down with such immediate power that everyone felt impelled to don the lightest of wear, muslin frocks and linen trousers already put aside. The adjustable canvas parasol without a handle was called into requisition, and fitted by its cunning device of holes and pegs onto the arm of the reclining chair, and even its shelter was felt to be insufficient against the midday glare. "I'm glad I'm here still for this," said Hans Castorp to his cousin. "It has been so wretched at times, and now it is as though we had the winter behind us, and only good weather to look forward to." He was quite right. There were indeed not many signs that pointed to the true state of the calendar, and even those there were did not strike the eye. Aside from the few oak trees that had been set out down in the Platz, where they had just managed to survive, and long before now had despondently shed their leaves, the whole region held no deciduous trees to give the landscape an autumnal cast. Only the hybrid alpine alder, which renews its soft needles as though they were leaves, showed a wintry baldness. The other trees of the region, whether towering or stunted, were evergreen pines and firs, invincible against the assaults of this irregular winter, which might scatter its snowstorms through all the months of the year. Only the many-shaded, rust-red tone that lay over the forest gave notice, despite the glowing sunshine, of a declining year. Yet, looking closer, there were the wild flowers, speaking, though softly, yet to the same effect. The meadow orchis, the bushy aquilegia were no longer in bloom, only the gentian and the lowly autumn crocus, bearing witness to the inner sharpness of the superficially heated air that could pierce one to the bone as one sat, like a chill and fever, though one glowed outwardly from the ardor of the sun. Hans Castorp did not keep inward count of the time, as does the man who husbands it, notes its passing, divides and tells and labels its units. He had not heeded the silent entry of the 10th month, but he was arrested by its appeal to the senses, this glowing heat that concealed the frost within and beneath it. It was a sensation which, to anything like this degree, he had never before experienced, and it aroused him to the culinary comparison which he made to Joachim, of an omelette in surprise, holding an ice concealed within the hot froth of the beaten egg. He often made such comments, talking headlong and volubly, as a man does in a feverish chill. But between whiles he was silent. We shall not say self-absorbed, for his attention was presumably directed outwards, though upon a single point. All else, whether of the animate or the inanimate world, swam about him in a mist of his own making, which Hofrat Behrens and Dr. Krokowski would doubtless have explained as the product of soluble toxins, as the befuddled one himself did also, though without having the slightest power or even desire to rid himself of the state they induced. For that is an intoxication by which one is possessed, under the influence of which one abhors nothing more than the thought of sobriety. It asserts itself against impressions that would weaken its force. It will not admit them. It wards them off. Hans Castorp was aware, and had even spoken of the fact, that Madame Chauchat's profile was not her strong point, that it was no longer quite youthful, was even a little sharp. And the consequence? He avoided looking at her in profile. He literally closed his eyes when he caught that view of her, even at a distance. It pained him. Why? Should not reason have leaped to take advantage of the favorable moment to reassert itself? But what do we ask? He grew pale with rapture when, tempted by the brilliant weather, she appeared at second breakfast in the white lace matinee which made her look so ravishing, appeared late, accompanied by the banging of the door, smiling, her arms raised in a pretty posture, and presented herself thus to the dining-room before she glided to her seat. But he was enraptured not so much because she looked so charming, as because her charm added strength to the sweet intoxication in his brain, the intoxication that willed to be, that cared only to be justified and nourished. An authority of Ludovico Settembrini's way of thinking might have characterized as depravity, as a form of depravity, such a lack of good intention. Hans Castorp sometimes pondered over the literary things the Italian had said about illness and despair, which he had found incomprehensible, or at least pretended to himself to find them so. He looked at Claudia Chauchat, at the flexity of her back, the posture of her head. He saw her come habitually late to table, without reason or excuse, solely out of a lack of order and disciplined energy. He saw the same lack when she let slam every door through which she passed, when she molded bread pellets at the table, when she gnawed her fingers, and he had a suspicion, which he did not put into words, that if she was ill, and that she was, probably incurably, since she had been up here so often and so long, her illness was in good part, if not entirely, a moral one. As Settembrini had said, neither the ground nor the consequence of her slackness, but precisely one and the same thing. He recalled the contemptuous gesture of the humanist when he spoke of the Parthians and Scythians in whose company he was forced to take the rest cure. It had been a gesture not only of deliberate, but also of natural and instinctive disdain, and that feeling was quite comprehensible to Hans Castorp. Had he not once, who always sat so erect at table, loathed and despised the banging of doors, and never was tempted to gnaw his fingers, because to that end Maria had been given him instead, had he not once taken deep offense at the unmannerly behavior of Frau Chauchat, and felt an unconquerable sense of superiority when he heard the narrow-eyed one essay to speak his mother tongue? The present state of his feelings, however, had put on one side any such sentiments as these. It was now the Italian who was the object of his irritation, because he, in his benightedness, had spoken of Parthians and Scythians, and had not meant thereby the persons at the bad Russian table, the shock-headed, linenless students, who sat there disputing endlessly in their outlandish tongue, which was obviously the only one they knew, and which, in its soft, spineless character, reminded Hans Castorp of the thorax, without ribs Hofrat barons had described to him. True, the manners and customs of such people might readily awaken feelings of disgust in the breast of a humanist. They ate with their knives and unmentionably messed the front of their blouses. Settembrini asserted that one of them, a medical student well on in his training, was so ignorant of Latin as not to know, for example, what the word vacuum meant. As for the married couple in number 32, Hans Castorp's own daily experience of them was such as to render quite credible Frau Storr's report that when the bathing master entered their room in the morning for the usual massage, they received him lying in bed together. All this might well be true, but after all, the distinction between good and bad was a plain one. It did not exist for nothing. Hans Castorp assured himself that he felt only contempt for any propagandist of the Republic and the bellow style who went about with his nose in the air and calmly, with particular calm, although at the same time both febrile and fuddled, lumped the members of both tables together under the title of Parthians and Scythians. Hans Castorp understood only too well the sense in which he used it, since he had begun to understand the connection between Frau Chauchat's illness and her slackness. But as he had one day put it to Joachim, one begins by being angry and disgusted, and then all at once something quite different enters in, that has nothing to do with moral judgment. And it is all up with your severity. You're simply not at home to pedagogic influences, however Republican, however eloquent. But we are impelled to ask, probably again in the spirit of Ludovico Settembrini, what sort of questionable experience is this, which palsies a man's judgment, robs him of all claim to it, or even makes him waive that claim, and experience in so doing the abandonment of ecstasy? We do not ask its name, for that everyone knows. Our question rather refers to its moral quality, and we confess that we do not anticipate any very self-confident reply. In Hans Castorp's case, its nature was evident in the extent to which he not only ceased to exercise his judgment, but even began to experiment for his own part and upon his own mortal vesture. He tried, for instance, how it would feel to sit at table with his back all relaxed, and discovered that it afforded sensible relief to the pelvic muscles. Again, one day, instead of punctiliously closing a door behind him, he let it slam, and this too he found both fitting and agreeable. It corresponded to the shoulder shrug with which Joachim had greeted him at the station, and which was so habitual among those up here. In brief, Our traveler was now over head and ears in love with Claudia Chowchat. We may still use the phrase, since we have already obviated any possible misunderstanding on the score of it. We have seen that the essence of his passion was something quite other than the tender and pensive mood of that oft-quoted ditty. Rather, it was a wild and vagrant variation upon the lovesick lute. It was mingled frost and fire, like the state of a fever patient, or the October air in these high altitudes. What he actually lacked, in fact, was an emotional bridge between two extremes. On the one hand, his passion dwelt, with an immediacy that left the young man pale and staring, upon Frau Chauchat's knee, the line of her thigh, her back, her neck bone, her arms that pressed together her little breasts. In a word, it dwelt upon her body, her idle, accentuated body, exaggerated by disease and rendered twice over body. And on the other hand, it was something in the highest degree fleeting and tenuous, a thought, nay, a dream, the frightful, infinitely alluring dream of a young man whose unspoken, unconscious questioning of the universe has received no answer save a hollow silence. We have as much right as the next person to our private thoughts about the story we are relating, and we would here hazard the surmise that young Hans Castorp would never have overstepped so far the limits originally fixed for his day if to his simple soul there might have been vouchsafed, out of the depth of his time, any reasonably satisfying explanation of the meaning and purpose of man's life. For the rest, his lovesick state afforded him all the joy and all the anguish proper to it the world over. The anguish is acute. It has, like all anguish, a mortifying element. It shatters the nervous system to an extent that takes the breath away and can wring tears from the eyes of a grown man. As for the joys, to do them justice, they were manifold, and no less piercing than the anguish, though their occasion might be trifling indeed. Almost any moment of the Berghof day might bring one forth. For example, about to enter the dining room, Hans Castorp would perceive the object of his dreams behind him, an experience clear and simple in anticipation, but inwardly ravishing to the point of tears. Their eyes meet at close range, his own and her gray-green ones, whose slightly oriental shape and position pierce him to the very marrow. He is incapable of connected thought, but unconsciously steps back to give her precedence through the door. With a half-smile, a half-audible merci, she accepts his conventional courtesy and, passing him by, enters the room. He stands there, within the aura of her personality as it sweeps past, idiotic with happiness at the encounter and at the word which has been uttered by her mouth directly for his ear. He follows her, he moves unsteadily to his own table and, sinking into his chair, becomes aware that Claudia, as she too takes her place, has turned to look at him. He thinks she wears an expression as though musing on their encounter at the door. Oh, unbelievable adventure! Oh, joy, rapture, and boundless exultation! No, this drunkenness of fantastic bliss Hans Castorp could never have experienced at the glance of any healthy little goose down in the flatland, to whom he might have, calmly, correctly, and with most definite intentions, given his heart, and devoted the sentiments described in the song. He greets the schoolmistress with feverish sprightliness. She has seen the whole thing, and her downy old cheek wears its dusky signal, and then bombards Miss Robinson with English conversation, so absurdly that she, not versed in the ecstatic, fairly recoils and measures him with mistrustful eyes. Another time, as they sit at the evening meal, the serene rays of the setting sun fall upon the good Russian table. The curtains have been drawn over the window and the veranda door, but somewhere there is a little crack, and through it the red gleam finds its way, not hot, but dazzling, and falls upon Frau Chauchat's face, so that she shields it with her hand as she sits talking with a concave countryman on her right. It is annoying, but not serious. Nobody troubles about it, probably not even the fair one herself. But across the dining room Hans Castorp sees it, quiescent a while, like the others. He examines the situation, follows the course of the ray of light, makes up his mind where it enters. It comes from the bay window in the right-hand corner, between the veranda door and the bad Russian table, at a goodish distance from Frau Chauchat's place, and almost equally far from Hans Castorp's. Without a word he gets up and, serviette in hand, crosses over among the tables, draws the cream-colored curtains so that they lap well over one another, convinces himself by a glance over his shoulder that the ray from the setting sun is shut out and Frau Chauchat relieved, and with an air of perfect equanimity goes back to his place. An observant young man who takes it upon himself to perform a needful courtesy, neglected by others. But few of them even noticed his act. Frau Chauchat, however, instantly felt the relief, and turned round, remaining in that position until Hans Castorp had resumed his place and, sitting down, looked over at her when she thanked him with a friendly, rather surprised smile, and a bow that was less an inclination than a shoving forward of the head. He acknowledged by a bow in his turn. His heart stood stock still. It seemed not to beat. Only after the whole thing was over did it begin again, and hammered, and only then did he become conscious that Joachim had kept his eyes directed upon his plate. Afterwards, too, he realized that Frau Stor had nudged Dr. Blumenkohl in the side, and then looked about at their own and other tables, trying to catch people's eyes. All this is the sheerest commonplace, but the commonplace becomes remarkable when it springs from remarkable soil. There were periods of strain and periods when the tension between them beneficently relaxed, though perhaps the tension existed less between them than it did in Hans Castorp's fevered imagination, for how far Madame Chauchat was affected we can only guess. In these days of fine weather the majority of the guests betook themselves to the veranda after the midday meal and stood about in groups, sunning themselves, for a quarter-hour or so, in a scene much like that on the Sunday afternoons of the fortnightly concerts. All these young people, absolutely idle, overfed on a meat and sweet diet, and without exception feverish, chattered and laughed, philandered, made eyes. Frau Salomon from Amsterdam would perch on the balustrade, hard pressed on the right by the knees of the thick-lipped Ganser, on the left by the Swedish minion, who, it appeared, was quite recovered, but extending his cure for a little space before going home. Frau Iltis was apparently a widow, for she had rejoiced only lately in the visit of a fiancé, a melancholy, inferior-looking person, whose presence had not in the least prevented her from accepting the attentions of the hook-nosed, fiery-eyed Captain Miklosic, him of the wax mustachios and swelling chest. New figures turned up on the terrace, ladies of various nationalities from the general rest halls, and new arrivals since the 1st of October, whom Hans Castorp barely knew by name. Then there were cavaliers of her Albin's kidney, monocled youths of 17, a spectacled, rosy-faced young Dutchman with a mania for collecting postage stamps, certain Greeks, with pomaded hair and almond-shaped eyes, inclined to overreach at table, and a pair of young dandies who were nicknamed Max and Moritz, and bore a great reputation for breaking out of bounds. The humpbacked Mexican, whose ignorance of any language save his own lent him the facial expression of a deaf person, took endless photographs, dragging his tripod from one point to another on the terrace. Sometimes the Hofrat would appear and perform his stunt with the bootlaces. And somewhere in the thick of the crowd would lurk solitary the religious devotee from Mannheim. Hans Castorp would watch disgustedly to see his great sad eyes take their secret way. But to return, by way of example, to some of those strains and stresses to which Hans Castorp's state was prone. Our young man was sitting on a painted garden chair, with his back against the wall, talking with his cousin, whom he had forced, against his will, to come outside. In front of him, by the balustrade, Frau Chauchat stood smoking with her table-mates. He talked for her benefit. She turned her back. His thirst for conversation was not satisfied by Joachim. He must needs make an acquaintance. And whose? No other than Hermine Kleefeld's. He directed a casual word toward that young lady, then presented himself and his cousin by name, and drew up another chair, in order to carry on the game. Did she know, he asked, what a deuce of a fright she had put him in, at their first encounter, when she had whistled him such an inspiriting welcome? He did not mind owning that she had accomplished her purpose. He had felt as though someone had hit him on the head. She might ask his cousin. He called it an outrage, frightening harmless strangers like that, piping at them with her pneumothorax, and so forth and so on. Joachim, quite aware of the role that was being forced upon him, sat with his eyes on the ground. Even Fräulein Kleefeld gradually perceived, from Hans Castorp's distraught and wandering eye that she was being made a tool of, and felt piqued accordingly. And still the poor youth went on smirking and turning phrases and modulating his voice, until at last he actually succeeded in making Frau Chauchat turn round and look him in the face. But only for a moment. Her Pribislav eyes glided rapidly down his figure, as he sat there one knee over the other, with a deliberate insouciance which had all the effect of scorn. They paused for a space upon his yellow boots, and then carelessly, with perhaps a smile in their depths, withdrew. It was a bitter, bitter blow. Hans Castorp talked on a while, feverishly. Then, inwardly smitten by the power of that gaze upon his boots, he fell silent almost in the middle of a word, and lapsed into deep dejection. Fräulein Kleefeld, bored and offended, went her way. Joachim remarked, not without irritation, that perhaps they might go up to the rest cure now. And a broken spirit answered feebly that they might. Hans Castorp anguished piteously for 2 days. Nothing occurred in that time to be balsam for his smarting wound. What had she meant by her look? Why, in the name of reason, had she visited him with her scorn? Did she regard him merely as a healthy young noodle from down in the flatland, whose receptivity was sure to be of the harmless sort, as a guileless, ordinary chap, who went about laughing and earning his daily bread and filling his belly full, as a model pupil in the school of life, with no comprehension of anything but the tedious advantages of a respectable career? Was he asked himself, a mere feckless tourist and 3 weeks' guest, or was he a man who had made his profession on the score of a moist spot, a member of the order, one of those up here, with a good 2 months to his credit, and had not Mercurius only yesterday evening climbed up to 100 degrees? Ah, here, even here, lay the bitter drop that overflowed his cup. Mercurius had ceased to mount. The fearful depression of these days had a chilling, sobering, relaxing effect upon Hans Castorp's system, which, to his profound chagrin, displayed itself in a reduced degree of fever, scarcely higher than normal. He had the cruel experience of proving to himself that all his anguish, all his dejection, had no other result than to separate him still further from Claudia and from that which was significant in her existence. The 3rd day brought the blessed release. It was early upon a magnificent October morning, sunny and fresh. The meadows were covered with silvery gray webs. The sun and the waning moon both hung high up in a lucent heaven. The cousins were abroad earlier than usual, meaning to honor the fine weather by extending their morning walk a little further than the prescribed limits and continuing the forest path beyond the bench by the watercourse. Joachim's curve, too, had lately shown a gratifying decrease. He had accordingly suggested this refreshing irregularity, and Hans Castorp had not said no. "We seem to be cured," he said. "No fever, free of infection, as good as ripe for the world again. Why shouldn't we have our fling?" They set out with walking sticks, and hatless, for since his profession, Hans Castorp had resigned himself to the prevailing custom, despite the original assertion of his own contrary-minded conventions. But they had not yet covered the initial ascent of the reddish path, had arrived only at about that point where the novice had once encountered the pneumatic crew, when they saw at some distance ahead of them, slowly mounting, Frau Chauchat. Frau Chauchat in white, a white sweater and white flannel skirt, even white shoes. Her red-blonde hair gleamed in the morning sun. To be precise, Hans Castorp saw her. Joachim was made aware of her presence by an unpleasant sensation of being dragged and pulled along by his cousin, who had started up at a great pace, after having suddenly checked and almost stood still on the path. Joachim found the compulsion exceedingly annoying. His breath came shorter. He began to cough. Hans Castorp, with his eyes on his goal, and his breathing apparatus apparently in splendid trim, gave little heed, and Joachim, having recognized the situation for what it was, drew his brows together and kept step for step, feeling it out of the question to let his cousin go on alone. The lovely morning made Hans Castorp sprightly, and his soul, in that period of black depression, had secretly assembled its powers. He felt a sure intuition that the moment was come to break the ban. He strode on, dragging the panting and reluctant Joachim in his train, and they had as good as overtaken Frau Chauchat, at the point where the path grew level and turned to the right along the wooded hillock. Here the young man slackened his pace, not to be breathless with exertion in the moment of carrying out his purpose. And just beyond the bend in the path, between mountain and precipice, where the sunlight slipped athwart the boughs of the rust-colored firs, it actually fell out. The wonder came to pass that Hans Castorp, on Joachim's left, overtook the fragile fair one. He went by her with a manly stride, and then, at the moment when he was beside her, on her right, greeted her with a profoundly respectful, hatless inclination of the head, and a murmured "Good morning," to which she answered by a friendly bow that showed no trace of surprise, and a good morning in her turn. She said it in Hans Castorp's mother tongue, and smiled with her eyes. And all that was something different, something fundamentally and blessedly other than that look she had bent upon his boots. It was a gift of fortune, an unexampled turn in affairs, a joy well-nigh beyond comprehending. It was the blessed release. Transported by that word, look, and smile, half blinded by his senseless joy, Hans Castorp trod on winged feet, hurrying the misused Joachim with him, who uttered not a word, and gazed away down the steep. It had been a maneuver of a rather unscrupulous sort. In Joachim's eyes, as Hans Castorp well knew, it looked very like treachery. Yet it was not the same thing as borrowing a lead pencil of a perfect stranger. One might even say it would have been ill-bred to pass by a lady with whom one had been for months under the same roof, and not salute her. They had even been in conversation with her, that time in the waiting room. That was why Joachim could say nothing, but Hans Castorp well knew another reason that made his honor-loving cousin walk on in silence with averted head, while he himself was so supremely happy, so glad all over, at the success of his maneuver. Never a man down in the flatland who had given his heart to some healthy, commonplace little goose, been successful in his suit, and experienced all the orthodox and anticipatory gratifications proper to his state. Never could such a man be blissfuller, no, not half so blissful, as Hans Castorp now over this momentary joy which he had snatched. And so, after a while, he clapped his cousin heartily on the shoulder and said, "Hello, what's the matter with you? Isn't it magnificent today? Let's go down to the courthouse afterwards. There will probably be music. Perhaps they'll play that thing from Carmen." "What's the matter? Has anything got under your skin?" "No," Joachim answered. "But you look so hot. I'm afraid your curve has gone up again." It had. The greeting he had exchanged with Claudia Chauchat had overcome the mortifying depression. It was at bottom the consciousness of this which had lain at the root of Hans Castorp's gratification. Yes, Joachim was right. Mercurius was mounting again. When Hans Castorp consulted him, on their return from their walk, he had climbed up to 100.4 degrees. Encyclopedic. If certain insinuations on her Settembrini's part had angered Hans Castorp, the annoyance was quite unjustified, as also his feeling that the schoolmaster had been spying on him. A blind man must have seen how it stood with the youth. He himself did nothing to conceal his state, being prevented by a certain native and lofty simplicity. He inclined rather to wear his heart upon his sleeve, in contrast, if you like, favorable contrast, to the devotee from Mannheim, with his thin hair and furtive mien. But in general we would emphasize the fact that people in Hans Castorp's state regularly feel a craving for self-revelation, an impulse to confess themselves, a blind preoccupation with self, and a thirst to possess the world of their own emotions, which is the more offensive to the sober onlooker, the less sense, reasonableness, or hope there lies in the whole affair. How people in this state go about to betray themselves is hard to define, but it seems they can neither do nor leave undone anything which would not have that effect, doubly so, then in a society like that of the Berghof, where, as the critically minded Herr Settembrini once expressed it, people were possessed of two ideas, and only two, temperature, and then again temperature. By the second temperature, he meant preoccupation with such questions as, for instance, with whom Frau Consul General Wurmbrand from Vienna consoled herself for the defection of Captain Miklosik, whether with the Swedish minion, or lawyer Paravant from Dortmund, or both. Everybody knew that the bond between the lawyer and Frau Salomon from Amsterdam, after subsisting for several months, had been broken by common consent, and that Frau Salomon had followed the leanings of her time of life, and taken up with callow youth. The thick-lipped Ganser from Hermine Kleefeld's table was for the present under her wing. She had taken him, to have and to hold, as Frau Storr, in legal parlance, yet not without perspicuity, had put it, and thus Lawyer Paravant was free either to quarrel or to compound with the Swede over the favors of the Frau Consul General, as seemed to him advisable. These affairs, then, in which, of course, the passage along the balconies, at the end of the glass partitions, played a considerable role, were rife in Berghof society, particularly among the fevered youth. They occupied people's minds, they were a salient feature of life up here, and even in saying thus much we are far from having precisely defined the position with regard to them. Hans Castorp, on this subject, received a singular impression. It was that a certain fundamental fact of life, which is conceded the world over to be of great importance, and is the fertile theme of constant allusion, both in jest and earnest, that this fundamental fact of life bore up here an entirely altered emphasis. It was weighty with a new weight. It had an accent, a value, and a significance which were utterly novel, and which set the fact itself in a light to make it look much more alarming than it had been before. Thus far, whenever we have referred to any questionable performances at the Berghof, we have done so in what may have seemed a light and jesting tone, this without prejudice to our real opinion as to the levity, or otherwise, of the performances, and solely for the usual obscure reasons which prompt other people to adopt the same. But, as a matter of fact, that tone was far less usual in our present sphere than it is elsewhere in the world. Hans Castorp had considered himself pretty well informed on the subject of the above-named fact of life, which has always and everywhere been such a favorite target for shafts of wit, and he may have been right in so considering. But now he found that the knowledge he had had down in the flat land had been most inadequate, that he had actually been in a state of simple ignorance. For his personal emotions in the time of his stay up here, upon the nature of which we have been at some pains to enlighten the reader, and which had been at moments so acute as to wring from the young man that cry of, "Oh, my God!" had opened his eyes, had made him capable of hearing and comprehending the wild, the overstrained, the namelessly extravagant key in which all the affairs up here were set. Not that, even up here, they did not make jests on the subject. But up here, far more than down below, jests seemed out of place. They made one's teeth to chatter, and took away one's breath. They betrayed themselves too plainly for what they were, a thin and obvious disguise for a hidden extremity, or rather, an extremity impossible to hide. Hans Castorp well remembered the mottled pallor of Joachim's skin when, for the first and only time, he had innocently alluded to Marussia's physical charms in the light tone he might have assumed at home. He remembered the chill withdrawal of the blood from his own face, the time he had drawn the curtain to shield Madame Chauchat from the sun. He knew that he had seen the same look on other faces up here, both before and since. He usually remarked it in pairs, as, for example, on the faces of Frau Salomon and young Ganser, in the beginning of that relation between them so happily described by Frau Storr. Hans Castorp, we say, recalled all this, and realized that under such circumstances it would not only have been very hard for him not to betray himself, but that the effort would not have been worth his pains. In other words, not alone the noble simplicity which did him honor, but also a certain sympathetic something in the air urged him not to do violence to his feelings or make any secret of his condition. Joachim had, as we know, early spoken of the difficulty of forming acquaintances up here. In reality, this arose chiefly from the fact that the cousins formed a miniature group by themselves in the society of the cure, but also because the soldierly Joachim was bent on nothing else but speedy recovery, and hence objected on principle to any closer contact or more social relations with his fellow sufferers. It was a good deal this attitude of his that prevented his cousin from exposing his feelings more freely to the world at large. Even so, there came an evening when Joachim might behold his cousin the center of a group composed of Hermine Kleefeld, Ganser, Rasmussen, and the youth of the monocle and the fingernail, making an impromptu speech on the subject of Frau Chauchat's peculiar and exotic facial structure, and betraying himself by his unsteady voice and the excited glitter of his eyes, until his listeners exchanged glances, nudged each other,
and tittered.
This was painful for Joachim, but the object of their mirth seemed insensible to his own self-betrayal. Perhaps he felt that his state, if concealed and unregarded, would never come to any proof. He might count, however, on a general understanding of it, and as for the inevitable malice that went with it, he took that for granted. People, not only at his own table, but at neighboring ones as well, enjoyed seeing him flush and pale when the glass door slammed. And even this gratified him. It was like an outward confirmation and assertion of his inner frenzy, which seemed to him calculated to forward his affair and encourage his vague and senseless hopes. And so it too made him happy. It came to this, that people actually stood about in groups to observe the infatuated youth, after dinner, on the terrace, or on a Sunday afternoon before the porter's lodge, when the letters were distributed, for on that day they were not carried to the patients' rooms. He was quite generally known to be very far gone, drunk as a lord, and not caring who knew it. Frau Storr, Fräulein Engelhardt, Hermine Kleefeld, and her friend the taper-faced girl, Herr Albin, the young man with the fingernail, and perhaps others among the guests, would stand together and watch him, with the corners of their mouths drawn down, fairly chortling, whilst he, poor wight, his face aglow with the heat that from the first had never left him, with the glittering eye the gentleman rider's cough had kindled, would gaze, forlornly and frantically smiling, in one certain direction. It was really splendid of Herr Settembrini under these circumstances to go up to Hans Castorp, engage him in conversation, and ask him how he did. But it is doubtful whether the young man knew how to value and to be grateful for such benevolence and freedom from prejudice. One Sunday afternoon the guests were thronging about the porter's lodge, stretching out their hands for letters. Joachim was among the foremost, but Hans Castorp had stopped in the rear, angling, in the fashion we have described, for a look from Claudia Chauchat. She was standing nearby, among a group of her table-mates, waiting until the press about the lodge should be lightened. It was an hour when all the patients mingled, an hour rich in opportunity, and for that reason beloved of our young man. The week before, he had stood at the window so close to Madame Chauchat that she had in fact jostled him, and then, with a little bow, had said, "Pardon." Whereat he, with a feverish presence of mind for which he thanked his stars, had responded, "Pas de quoi, madame." What a blessed dispensation of Providence, he thought, that there should be a regular Sunday afternoon distribution of letters. One might say that he spent the week in waiting for the next week's delivery. And waiting means hurrying on ahead. It means regarding time and the present moment not as a boon, but an obstruction. It means making their actual content null and void by mentally overleaping them. Waking, we say, is long. We might just as well, or more accurately, say it is short, since it consumes whole spaces of time without our living them or making any use of them as such. We may compare him who lives on expectation to a greedy man, whose digestive apparatus works through quantities of food without converting it into anything of value or nourishment to his system. We might almost go so far as to say that, as undigested food makes man no stronger, so time spent in waiting makes him no older. But in practice, of course, there is hardly such a thing as pure and unadulterated waiting. Well, the week had been somehow devoured, and the hour for the Sunday afternoon post came round again, so like the other it seemed never to have changed. Like to that other, what thrilling opportunities it offered, what prospects lay concealed within it of coming into social relations with Frau Chauchat. Prospects that made the heart of young Hans Castorp leap and contract, yet without actually issuing an action, for against their doing so lay certain obstacles of a nature partly military, partly civil. In other words, they were in part the fruit of Joachim's presence, in part the result of Hans Castorp's own moral compunctions, but also, in part, they rested upon his sure intuition that social relations with Frau Chauchat, conventional relations, in which one made bows and addressed her as madam and spoke French as far as possible, were not the thing at all, were neither necessary nor desirable. He stood and watched her laugh as she spoke, precisely as Pribislav Hip had laughed as he spoke, that time in the schoolyard. She opened her mouth rather wide, and her slanting, gray-green eyes narrowed themselves to slits above the cheekbones. That was, to be sure, not beautiful, but when one is in love, the aesthetic judgment counts for as little as the moral. You are expecting dispatches, engineer? Only one person could talk like that, and he a disturber of Hans Castorp's peace. The young man started and turned toward Settembrini, who stood there smiling the same fine, humanistic smile that had sat upon his features when he greeted the newcomer at the bench by the watercourse. Now, as then, it mortified Hans Castorp. We know how often, in his dreams, he had sought to drive away the organ-grinder as an element offensive to his peace, but the waking man is more moral than the sleeping, and, as before, the sight of that smile not only had a sobering effect upon Hans Castorp, but gave him a sense of gratitude, as though it had responded to his need. Dispatches, Settembrini? Good Lord, I'm no ambassador. There might be a postcard there for one of us. My cousin is just asking. That devil on 2 sticks in there has handed mine out to me already, Settembrini said, and carried his hand to the side pocket of the inevitable pilot coat. Interesting matter, I must confess, of literary and social import. It is about an encyclopedic publication to which a philanthropic institution has considered me worthy to contribute. Beautiful work, in short. Settembrini interrupted himself. But how about you? He asked. How are your affairs going? For instance, how far has the process of acclimatization gone? You have not been so long among us, but that one may still put the question. Thanks, Settembrini. It still has its difficulties, it seems. It very likely will have up to the last day. My cousin told me when I came that many people never got used to it. But one gets used in time to not getting used. A complicated process, laughed the Italian. An odd way of settling down in a place. But of course youth is capable of anything. It doesn't get used to things, but it strikes roots. And after all, this isn't a Siberian penal settlement.
No.
You have a fancy for Oriental simile. Natural enough. Asia surrounds us. Wherever one's glance rests, a Tartar physiognomy. Settembrini gave a discreet glance over his shoulder. Genghis Khan, he said. Wolves of the steppes, snow, vodka, the knout, Schlüsselburg, Holy Russia. They ought to set up an altar to Pallas Athene, here in the vestibule, to ward off the evil spell. Look yonder, there is a species of Ivan Ivanovitch without a shirt front, having a disagreement with Lawyer Parvant. Both of them want to be in the front rank to receive their letters. I can't tell which of them is in the right, but, for my part, Lawyer Parvant fights under the aegis of the goddess. He is an ass, of course, but at least he knows some Latin. Hans Castorp laughed, a thing Settembrini never did. One could not imagine him laughing heartily. He never got further than the fine, dry crisping of the corner of his mouth. He looked at the laughing young man and presently asked, Have you received your diapositive? I have received it, Hans Castorp weightily affirmed. Just the other day. Here it is, and he felt for it in his inner breast pocket. Ah, you carry it in a case, like a certificate, as it were a sort of membership card. Very good. Let me see it. And Settembrini held it against the light, between the thumb and forefinger of his left hand, a little glass plate framed in strips of black paper. The gesture was a common one up here, one often saw it. His face, with the black almond-shaped eyes, displayed a slight grimace as he did so, but whether this happened in the effort to see more clearly or for other causes, he did not permit it to appear. Yes, yes, he said after a while. Here is your identity card. Thanks very much, and he handed the plate back to Hans Castorp over his shoulder, without looking. Did you see the strands? Asked Hans Castorp. And the nodules? You know, Settembrini answered him very deliberately, my opinion of these productions. You know, too, that those spots and shadows, they're very largely of physiological origin. I have seen 100 such pictures, looking very like this of yours. The decision as to whether they offered definite proof or not was left more or less to the discretion of the person looking at them. I speak as a layman, but a layman of a good many years' experience. Does your own look much worse than this one? Rather worse. I am aware, however, that our lords and masters do not base any diagnosis on the evidence of these toys alone. Then you purpose stopping the winter up here with us? Yes, Lord knows, I am beginning to get used to the idea of not going back until my cousin does. Getting used, that is, to not getting used, you put that very wittily. I hope you have received supplies from home. Winter clothing, stout footgear? Everything. All in the proper order. I informed my relatives, and our housekeeper sent me everything by express delivery. I shall do nicely now. I am relieved. But hold, you need a bag, a fur sack. What are we thinking of? This late summer is treacherous. It can turn to winter inside an hour. You will be spending the coldest months up here. Yes, the sleeping sack, Hans Castorp said. That is a requisite, I suppose. It had crossed my mind that we must be going down to the Platz one of these days soon to buy one. One never needs the thing again, of course, but even for the 5 or 6 months it is worthwhile. It is, engineer, said Settembrini in a low voice, coming close to the young man as he addressed him. Don't you know there is something frightful in the way you fling the months about? Frightful because unnatural, inconsistent with your character. It is due solely to the facility of your time of life. Ah, the fatal facility of youth. It is the despair of the teacher, for its proneness to display itself in the wrong direction. I beg you, my young friend, not to adopt the phrases current up here, but to speak the language of the European culture native to you. Up here there is too much Asia. It is not without significance that the place is full of Muscovite and Mongolian types. These people, Herr Settembrini motioned with his chin over his shoulder. Do not put yourself in tune with them. Do not be infected with their ideas. Rather set yourself against them. Oppose your nature, your higher nature against them. Cling to everything which to you is by nature and tradition holy, as a son of the godlike West, a son of civilization, and, for example, time. This barbaric lavishness with time is in the Asiatic style. It may be a reason why the children of the East feel so much at home up here. Have you never remarked that when a Russian says 4 hours, he means what we do when we say one? It is easy to see that the recklessness of these people, where time is concerned, may have to do with the space conceptions proper to people of such endless territory. Great space, much time, they say. In fact, that they are the nation that has time and can wait. We Europeans, we cannot. We have as little time as our great and finely articulated continent has space. We must be as economical of the one as of the other. We must husband them. Engineer. Take our great cities, the centers and foci of civilization, the crucibles of thought. Just as the soil there increases in value and space becomes more and more precious, so, in the same measure, does time. Carpe diem. That was the song of a dweller in a great city. Time is a gift of God, given to man that he might use it, engineer, to serve the advancement of humanity. Whatever difficulty, if any, his phrases offered Herr Settembrini's Mediterranean palate, he brought them out with a clarity, a euphony, one might almost say a plasticity, that was truly refreshing. Hans Castorp made no answer save the short, stiff, embarrassed bow of a pupil receiving a reprimand. What could he have said? Herr Settembrini had delivered a private lecture, almost whispered it into his ear. With his back to the rest of the people in the room, it had been so pointed, so unsocial, so little conversable in its nature, that merely to commend its eloquence seemed lacking in tact. One does not tell a schoolmaster that he has expressed himself well. Hans Castorp, indeed, had done so once or twice in the early days of their acquaintance, probably from an instinct to preserve the social equilibrium, but the humanist's utterances had never before reached quite such a didactic pitch. There was nothing for it but to pocket the admonition, feeling as embarrassed as a schoolboy at so much moralizing. Moreover, one could see by Herr Settembrini's expression that he had not finished his train of thought. He still stood so close to Hans Castorp that the young man was constrained to bend a little backwards, and his black eyes gazed fixedly into the other's face. "You suffer, engineer," he went on. "You are like one distraught. Who could help seeing it? But your attitude towards suffering can be a European attitude. It should not be the Oriental, which in its soft abandonment inclines so readily to seek this spot. The Oriental attitude towards suffering is one of pity and a boundless patience. That cannot, it ought not to be ours, to be yours. Look, we were speaking of what the post had brought us. Look at these. Or better, come with me. It is impossible here. Let us withdraw, and I will disclose to you certain matters.
Come with me.
And turning, he drew Hans Castorp away, and they entered one of the small reception rooms, the first on the right next the vestibule, which stood empty. It was furnished as a reading and writing room, with oak paneling and a light, vaulted ceiling, bookcases, a center table covered with newspapers and holders and surrounded with seats, and writing appurtenances arranged in the bay windows. Her Settembrini advanced as far as the neighborhood of one of the windows. Hans Castorp followed. The door remained open. The Italian sought the baggy side pocket of his pilot coat and drew thence with impetuous hand a bundle of papers in a large, already opened envelope. Its contents, various printed matter and a sheet of writing, he ran through his fingers under Hans Castorp's eye. These papers, he said, bear the stamp, in French, of the International League for the Organization of Progress. I have them from Lugano, where there is an office of a branch of the League. You inquire after its principles, its scope? I will define them for you in 2 words. The League for the Organization of Progress deduces from Darwinian theory the philosophic concept that man's profoundest natural impulse is in the direction of self-realization. From this it follows that all those who seek satisfaction of this impulse must become co-laborers in the cause of human progress. Many are those who have responded to the call. There is a considerable membership in France, Italy, Spain, Turkey, and in Germany itself. I myself have the honor of having my name inscribed on the roll. A comprehensive and scientifically executed program has been drawn up, embracing all the projects for human improvement conceivable at the moment. We are studying the problem of our health as a race, and the means for combating the degeneration which is a regrettable accompanying phenomenon of our increasing industrialization. The League envisages the founding of universities for the people, the resolution of the class conflict by means of all the social ameliorations which recommend themselves for the purpose, and finally the doing away with national conflicts, the abolition of war through the development of international law. You perceive that the objects toward which the League directs its efforts are ambitious and broad in their scope. Several international periodicals are evidence of its activities. Monthly reviews, which contain articles in 3 or 4 languages on the subject of the progressive evolution of civilized humanity. Numerous local groups have been established in the various countries. It is expected that they will exert an edifying and enlightening influence by means of discussion evenings and appropriate Sunday observances. Above all, the League will strive its utmost to aid with the material at its disposal the political party of progress in every country. You follow me, engineer? Absolutely, Hans Castorp replied, with precipitation. He had, as he spoke, the feeling of a man who finds himself slipping, but for the moment contrives to keep his feet. Her Settembrini appeared satisfied. I assume that these are new and surprising ideas to you? Yes, I confess this is the first time I have heard of these endeavors. Ah, Settembrini murmured. Ah, if you had only heard of them earlier. But perhaps it is not yet too late. These circulars, you would like to know what they say? Listen. Last spring, a formal meeting of the League was called at Barcelona. You are aware that that city can boast of a quite special affinity with progressive political ideas. The Congress sat for a week, with banquets and festivities. I wanted to go. Good God, I yearned to be there and take part in the deliberations. But that scurvy rascal of a Hofrat forbade me on pain of death. So, well, I was afraid I should die, and I didn't go. I was in despair, as you may imagine, over the trick my unreliable health had played me. Nothing is more painful than to be prevented by our animal nature from being of service to reason. My satisfaction, therefore, over this communication from Lugano is the more lively. You're curious to know what it says? I can imagine. But first, a few brief explanations. The League for the Organization of Progress, mindful of its task of furthering human happiness, in other words, of combating human suffering by the available social methods, to the end of finally eliminating it altogether, mindful also of the fact that this lofty task can only be accomplished by the aid of sociology, the end and aim of which is the perfect state, the League, in session at Barcelona, determined upon the publication of a series of volumes, bearing the general title, The Sociology of Suffering. It should be the aim of the series to classify human suffering according to classes and categories and to treat it systematically and exhaustively. You ask, what is the use of classification, arrangement, systematization? I answer you. Order and simplification are the first steps toward the mastery of a subject. The actual enemy is the unknown. We must lead the human race up out of the primitive stages of fear and patient stupidity and set its feet on the path of conscious activity. We must enlighten it upon 2 points. First, that given effects become void when one first recognizes and then removes their causes. And second, that almost all individual suffering is due to disease of the social organism. Very well, this is the object of the sociological pathology. It will be issued in some 20-folio volumes, treating every species of human suffering, from the most personal and intimate to the great collective struggles arising from the conflicting interests of classes and nations. It will, in short, exhibit the chemical elements whose combination in various proportions results in all the ills to which our human flesh is heir. The publication will in every case take as its norm the dignity and happiness of mankind, and seek to indicate the measures and remedies calculated to remove the cause of each deviation. Famous European specialists, physicians, psychologists, and economists will share in the composition of this encyclopedia of suffering, and the General Editorial Bureau at Lugano will act as the reservoir to collect all the articles which shall flow into it. I can read in your eyes the question as to what my share is to be in all these activities.
Hear me to the end.
This great work will not neglect the belletrist in so far as he deals with human suffering. A volume is projected which shall contain a compilation and brief analysis of such masterpieces of the world's literature as come into question by depicting one or other kind of conflict for the consolation and instruction of the suffering. This, then, is the task entrusted to your humble servant in the letter you see here. You don't say, Her Settembrini. Allow me to offer you my heartiest congratulations. That is a magnificent commission just in your line, I should think. No wonder the League thought of you. And what joy you must feel to aid in the elimination of human suffering. It is a work very broad in its scope, Her Settembrini said thoughtfully, and will require much consideration and wide reading. Especially, he added, and his gaze seemed to lose itself in the immensity of his task, since literature has regularly chosen to depict suffering, and even second- and third-rate masterpieces treat of it in one form or another. But what of that? So much the better. However comprehensive the work may be, it is at least of a nature that will permit me to carry it on, if needs must, even in this accursed place, though I hope I need not be here long enough to bring it to a conclusion. That is something, he said, moving closer to Hans Castorp and subduing his voice nearly to a whisper. That is something which can hardly be said of the duties nature lays upon you, engineer. This is what I wanted to bring out. This is the word of warning I have been trying to utter. You know what admiration I feel for your profession. But as it is a practical, not an intellectual calling, you are differently situated from myself, in that you can only pursue it down in the world. Only there can you be a true European. Only there can you actively fight suffering, improve the time, further progress with your own weapons and in your own way. If I have told you of the task that has fallen to my lot, it was only to remind you, only to recall you to yourself, only to clarify certain conceptions of yours which the atmospheric conditions up here were obviously beginning to becloud. I would urge it upon you. Hold yourself upright, preserve your self-respect, do not give ground to the unknown. Flee from this sink of iniquity, this island of Circe, whereon you are not Odysseus enough to dwell in safety. You will be going on all fours. Already you are inclining toward your forward extremities, and presently you will begin to grunt. Have a care. The humanist had uttered these admonitions in the same low voice, shaking his head impressively. He finished with drawn brows and eyes directed toward the ground. To answer him slightly or jestingly, as Hans Castorp would once have done, was out of the question. The young man weighed that possibility for a second, standing with lowered lids. Then he lifted his shoulders and spoke, no louder than Her Settembrini. What shall I do? What I told you. You mean go away? Her Settembrini was silent. What you mean to say is that I should leave for home? It was the advice I gave you on the first evening, engineer. Yes, and then I was free to do so, though it seemed to me silly to throw up the sponge just because the air up here put me about a bit. But now it is a rather different state of affairs. I have been examined, and Hofrat Barons told me in so many words that it would be no good my going home. I should only have to come back again, and that if I stopped down there, the whole lobe would be at the devil before you could say Jack Robinson. I know, and now you have the evidence in your pocket. You say that so ironically, with the right kind of irony. Of course, that cannot for a moment be misunderstood. The direct and classic device of oratory, you see. I remember the things you say. But do you mean that after you have seen this photograph, after the X-ray and Barons's diagnosis, you take it upon yourself to advise me to go home? Settembrini hesitated for a second. Then he drew himself up and directed the gaze of his black eyes full upon Hans Castorp's face. He answered, with an emphasis not quite without theatrical effect, "Yes, engineer, I take it upon myself." But Hans Castorp's bearing too had stiffened. He stood with his heels together and looked straight at Herr Settembrini in his turn. This time it was a duel. Hans Castorp stood his ground. Influences from not far off gave him strength. Here was a schoolmaster, but yonder was a woman with narrow eyes. He made no apologies for his words. He did not beg Herr Settembrini not to take offense, he answered. Then you are more prudent for yourself than for others. You did not go to Barcelona in the face of the doctor's orders. You were afraid of death, and you stopped up here. To a certain point, Herr Settembrini's pose was undeniably shaken. His smile, as he answered, was slightly forced. I know how to value a ready answer, even though your logic smacks of sophistry. It would disgust me to enter the lists in the sort of rivalry that is too current up here. Otherwise, I might reply that my case is far more serious than yours, so much more, in fact, that it is only by artificial means, almost by deliberate self-deception, that I can keep alive the hope of leaving this place and having sight of the world below before I die. In the moment when that hope can no longer be decently sustained, in that moment I shall turn my back on this establishment and take private lodgings somewhere in the valley. That will be sad, but as the sphere of my labors is the freest, the least material in the world, the change cannot prevent me from resisting the forces of disease and serving the cause of humanity, up to my latest breath. The difference between us, in this respect, I have already pointed out to you. Engineer, you are not the man to assert your better self in these surroundings. I saw it at our first meeting. You reproach me with not having gone to Barcelona. I submitted to the prohibition, not to destroy myself untimely. But I did so with the most stringent reservations. My spirit protested in pride and anguish against the dictates of my wretched body. Whether that protest survives in you, as you comply with the behests of our powers that be, whether it is not rather the body and its evil propensities, to which you lend a ready ear. What have you against the body? Interrupted Hans Castorp suddenly, and looked at him with wide blue eyes, the whites of which were veined with blood. He was giddy with his own temerity and showed as much. Whatever am I saying? He thought. I'm getting out of my depth. But I won't give way. Now I have begun. I won't give him the last word if I can help it. Of course he will have it anyhow, but never mind. I will make the most of it while I can. He enlarged upon his objection. But you are a humanist, are you not? What can you have to say against the body? Settembrini's smile this time was unforced and confident. What have you against analysis? He quoted, with his head on one side. Are you down on analysis? You will always find me ready to answer you, engineer, he said, with a bow and a sweeping downward motion of the hand, particularly when your opposition is spirited, and you parry not without elegance. Humanist, yes, certainly, I am a humanist. You could never convict me of ascetic inclinations. I affirm, honor, and love the body, as I protest I affirm, honor, and love form, beauty, freedom, gaiety, the enjoyment of life. I represent the world, the interest of this life, against a sentimental withdrawal and negation, classicism against romanticism. I think my position is unequivocal. But there is one power, one principle, which commands my deepest assent, my highest and fullest allegiance and love. And this power, this principle, is the intellect. However much I dislike hearing that conception of moonshine and cobwebs people call the soul played off against the body, yet within the antithesis of body and mind, The body is the evil, the devilish principle, for the body is nature, and nature, within the sphere, I repeat, of her antagonism to the mind and to reason, is evil, mystical, and evil. You are a humanist? By all means I am a humanist because I am a friend of mankind, like Prometheus, a lover of humanity and human nobility. That nobility is comprehended in the mind, in the reason, and therefore you will level against me in vain the reproach of Christian obscurantism. Hans Castorp demurred. You will, Settembrini persisted, level this reproach in vain, if humanistic pride one day learns to feel as a debasement and disgrace the fact that the intellect is bound up with the body and with nature. Did you know that the great Plotinus is said to have made the remark that he was ashamed to have a body? Asked Settembrini. He seemed eager for a reply, and Hans Castorp was constrained to confess that this was the first he had heard of it. We have it from Porphyrius. An absurd remark, if you like. But the absurd is the intellectually honorable, and nothing can be more pitiable than the reproach of absurdity, leveled against the mind as it asserts its dignity against nature and refuses to abdicate before her. Have you heard of the Lisbon earthquake, engineer? An earthquake? No, I see no newspapers up here. You misunderstand me. En passant, let me say it is a pity, and very indicative of the spirit of this place, that you neglect to read the papers. But you misunderstand me. The convulsion of nature to which I refer is not modern. It took place some 150 years ago. I see. Oh, wait, I have it. I have read that Goethe said to his servant, that night in his bedchamber. No, it was not of that I was speaking, Settembrini interrupted him, closing his eyes, and shaking his small sallow hand in the air. Besides, you are confusing two catastrophes. You are thinking of the earthquake of Messina. I have in mind the one that visited Lisbon in the year 1755. Pardon. Well, Voltaire was outraged by it. Outraged? That is, how do you mean? He rebelled.
Yes.
He declined to accept that brutal fatum et factum. His spirit refused to abdicate before it. He protested in the name of reason and the intellect against that scandalous dereliction of nature, to which were sacrificed thousands of human lives and 3/4 of a flourishing city. You are astonished? You smile? You may well be astonished, but as for smiling, give me leave to tell you it is out of place. Voltaire's attitude was that of a worthy descendant of those old Gauls that shot their arrows against the heavens. There, engineer, you have the hostility the intellect feels against nature, its proud mistrust, its high-hearted insistence upon the right to criticize her and her evil, reason-denying power. Nature is force, and it is slavish to suffer force, to abdicate before it, to abdicate, that is, inwardly. And there too you have the humanistic position which runs not the slightest risk of involving itself in contradictions, or of relapsing into churchly hypocrisy, when it sees in the body the antagonist, the representative of the evil principle. The contradiction you imagine you see is at bottom always the same. What have you against analysis? Nothing, when it serves the cause of enlightenment, freedom, progress. Everything when it is pervaded by the horrible oat gout of the grave. And thus too with the body. We are to honor and uphold the body when it is a question of emancipation, of beauty, of freedom of thought, of joy, of desire. We must despise it in so far as it sets itself up as the principle of gravity and inertia when it obstructs the movement toward light. We must despise it in so far as it represents the principle of disease and death, in so far as its specific essence is the essence of perversity, of decay, sensuality, and shame. These last words Settembrini had uttered standing close to Hans Castorp, very rapidly and tonelessly, as though to make an end of the subject. Succor was nigh for the youth. Joachim entered the reading room, with 2 postcards in his hand. The Italian broke off, and the dexterity with which he altered his tone for one in a lighter and fitting social key was not lost upon his pupil, if so Hans Castorp may be called. There you are, Lieutenant. Have you been looking for your cousin? I must apologize. We had fallen into conversation, if I am not mistaken. We have even had a slight disagreement. He is not a bad reasoner, your cousin, a by no means contemptible antagonist in an argument, when he takes the notion. Humanura. Hans Castorp and Joachim Ziemsen, arrayed in white trousers and blue blazers, were sitting in the garden after dinner. It was another of those much-lauded October days, bright without being heavy, hot and yet with a tang in the air. The sky above the valley was a deep southern blue, and the pastures beneath, with the cattle tracks running across and across them, still a lively green. From the rugged slopes came the sound of cowbells. The peaceful, simple, melodious tintinnabulation came floating unbroken through the quiet, thin, empty air, enhancing the mood of solemnity that broods over the valley heights. The cousins were sitting on a bench at the end of the garden, in front of a semicircle of young firs. The small open space lay at the northwest of the hedged-in platform, which rose some 50 yards above the valley and formed the foundations of the Berghof building. They were silent. Hans Castorp was smoking. He was also wrangling inwardly with Joachim, who had not wanted to join the society on the veranda after luncheon, and had drawn his cousin against his will into the stillness and seclusion of the garden, until such time as they should go up to their balconies. That was behaving like a tyrant. When it came to that, they were not Siamese twins. It was possible for them to separate, if their inclinations took them in opposite directions. Hans Castorp was not up here to be company for Joachim. He was a patient himself. Thus he grumbled on, and could endure to grumble, for had he not Maria? He sat, his hands in his blazer pockets, his feet in brown shoes stretched out before him, and held the long, grayish cigar between his lips, precisely in the center of his mouth, and drooping a little. It was in the first stages of consumption. He had not yet knocked off the ash from its blunt tip. Its aroma was peculiarly grateful after the heavy meal just enjoyed. It might be true that in other respects getting used to life up here had mainly consisted in getting used to not getting used to it. But for the chemistry of his digestion, the nerves of his mucous membrane, which had been parched and tender, inclined to bleeding, it seemed that the process of adjustment had completed itself. For imperceptibly, in the course of these 9 or 10 weeks, his organic satisfaction in that excellent brand of vegetable stimulant or narcotic had been entirely restored. He rejoiced in a faculty regained. His mental satisfaction heightened the physical. During his time in bed, he had saved on the supply of 200 cigars which he had brought with him, and some of these were still left, but at the same time with his winter clothing from below, there had arrived another 500 of the Bremen make, which he had ordered through Chalene to make quite sure of not running out. They came in beautiful little varnished boxes, ornamented and gilt with a globe, several medals, and an exhibition building with a flag floating above it. As they sat, behold, there came Hofrat Behrens through the garden. He had taken his midday meal in the dining hall today, folding his gigantic hands before his place at Frau Salomon's table. After that he had probably been on the terrace, making this suitable personal remark to each and everybody, very likely displaying his trick with the bootlaces for such of the guests as had not seen it. Now he came lounging through the garden, wearing a check tailcoat instead of his smock, and his stiff hat on the back of his head. He too had a cigar in his mouth, a very black one, from which he was puffing great white clouds of smoke. His head and face, with the overheated purple cheeks, the snub nose, watery blue eyes, and little clipped mustache, looked small in proportion to the lank, rather warped and stooping figure, and the enormous hands and feet. He was nervous, visibly started when he saw the cousins, and seemed embarrassed over the necessity of passing them. But he greeted them in his usual picturesque and expansive fashion, with "Behold, behold," Timotheus, going on to invoke the usual blessings on their metabolisms, while he prevented their rising from their seats, as they would have done in his honor. Sit down, sit down. No formalities with a simple man like me. Out of place too, you being my patients, both of you. Not necessary. No objection to the status quo, and he remained standing before them, holding the cigar between the index and middle fingers of his great right hand. How's your cabbage leaf, Castorp? Let me see, I'm a connoisseur. That's a good ash. What sort of brown beauty have you there? Maria Mancini, Postre de Banquet, Bremen, a Hofrat. Costs little or nothing, 19 pfennigs in plain colors, but a bouquet you don't often come across at the price. Sumatra Havana wrapper, as you see. I am very wedded to them. It is a medium mixture, very fragrant, but cool on the tongue. Suits it to leave the ash long. I don't knock it off more than a couple of times. She has her whims, of course, has Maria, but the inspection must be very thorough, for she doesn't vary much, and draws perfectly even. May I offer you one? Thanks, we can exchange. And they drew out their cases. There's a thoroughbred for you, the Hofrat said, as he displayed his brand. Temperament, juicy, got some guts to it. St. Felix, Brazil, I've always stuck to this sort. Regular, begone, dull care. Burns like brandy, has something fulminating toward the end. But you need to exercise a little caution, can't light one from the other, more than a fellow can stand. However, better one good mouthful than any amount of nibbles. They twirled their respective offerings between their fingers, felt connoisseur-like the slender shapes that possessed, or so one might think, some organic quality of life, with their ribs formed by the diagonal parallel edges of the raised, here, and their porous wrapper, the exposed veins that seemed to pulsate, the small inequalities of the skin, the play of light on planes and edges. Hans Castorp expressed it. A cigar like that is alive, it breathes.
Fact.
Once, at home, I had the idea of keeping Maria in an airtight tin box, to protect her from damp. Would you believe it, she died. Inside of a week she perished, nothing but leathery corpses left. They exchanged experiences upon the best way to keep cigars, particularly imported ones. The Hofrat loved them. He would have smoked nothing but heavy Havanas, but they did not suit him. He told Hans Castorp about 2 little Henry Clays he had once taken to his heart, in an evening company, which had come within an ace of putting him under the sod. I smoked them with my coffee, he said, and thought no more of it. But after a while it struck me to wonder how I felt, and I discovered it was like nothing on earth. I don't know how I got home, and once there, well, this time, my son, I said to myself, you're a goner. Feet and legs like ice, reeking with cold sweat, white as a tablecloth, heart going always for Sunday, sometimes just a thread of a pulse, sometimes pounding like a trip hammer. Cerebration phenomenal. I made sure I was going to toddle off. That is the very expression that occurred to me, because at the time I was feeling as jolly as a sandboy. Not that I wasn't in a funk as well, because I was just one large blue funk all over. Still, funk and felicity aren't mutually exclusive, everybody knows that. Take a chap who's going to have a girl for the first time in his life. He is in a funk too, and so is she, and yet both of them are simply dissolving with felicity. I was nearly dissolving too. My bosom swelled with pride, and there I was, on the point of toddling off, but the Mylendonk got hold of me and persuaded me it was a poor idea. She gave me a camphor injection, applied ice compresses and friction, and here I am, saved for humanity. The Hofrat's large, goggling blue eyes watered as he told the story. Hans Castorp, seated in his capacity of patient, looked up at him with an expression that betrayed mental activity. You paint sometimes, don't you, Hofrat? He asked suddenly. The Hofrat pretended to stagger backwards. What the deuce? What do you take me for, youngster? I beg your pardon. I happened to hear somebody say so, and it just crossed my mind. Well, then, I won't trouble to lie about it. We're all poor creatures. I admit such a thing has happened. Anch, io sono pittor, as the Spaniard used to say. Landscape. Hans Castorp asked him succinctly, with the air of a connoisseur, circumstances betraying him to this tone. As much as you like, the Hofrat answered, swaggering out of sheer self-consciousness. Landscape, still life, animals, chap like me shrinks from nothing. No portraits. I've even thrown in a portrait or so. Want to give me an order? Ha ha. No, but it would be very kind of you to show us your picture sometime. We should enjoy it. Joachim looked blankly at his cousin, but then hastened to add his assurances that it would be very kind indeed of the Hofrat. Behrens was enchanted at the flattery. He grew red with pleasure. His tears seemed this time actually on the point of falling. With the greatest pleasure, he cried. On the spot if you like. Come on, come along with me. I'll brew us a Turkish coffee in my den. He pulled both young men from the bench and walked between them arm in arm, down the gravel path which led, as they knew, to his private quarters in the northwest wing of the building. I've dabbled a little in that sort of thing myself, Hans Castorp explained. You don't say. Gone in for it properly, oils. Oh, no, I never went further than a watercolor or so. A ship, a sea piece, childish efforts. But I'm fond of painting, and so I took the liberty. Joachim in particular felt relieved and enlightened by this explanation of his cousin's startling curiosity. It was in fact more on his account than on the Hofrats that Hans Castorp had offered it. They reached the entrance, a much simpler one than the impressive portal on the drive, with its flanking lanterns. A pair of curving steps led up to the oaken house door, which the Hofrat opened with a latchkey from his heavy bunch. His hand trembled. He was plainly in a nervous state. They entered an antechamber with clothes racks, where Behrens hung his bowler on a hook, and thence passed into a short corridor, which was separated by a glass door from that of the main building. On both sides of this corridor lay the rooms of a small private dwelling. Behrens called a servant and gave an order, then to a running accompaniment of whimsical remarks ushered them through a door on the right. They saw a couple of rooms furnished in banal middle-class taste, facing the valley and opening one into another through a doorway hung with portieres. One was an old German dining room, the other a living and working room, with woolen carpets, bookshelves and sofa, and a writing table above, which hung a pair of crossed swords and a student's cap. Beyond was a Turkish smoking cabinet. Everywhere were paintings, the work of the Hofrat. The guests went up to them at once on entering, courteously ready to praise. There were several portraits of his departed wife in oil. Also, standing on the writing table, photographs of her. She was a thin, enigmatic blonde, portrayed in flowing garments, with her hands, their fingertips just lightly enlaced, against her left shoulder, and her eyes either directed toward heaven or else cast upon the ground, shaded by long, thick, obliquely outstanding eyelashes. Never once was the departed one shown looking directly ahead of her toward the observer. The other pictures were chiefly mountain landscapes, mountains in snow and mountains in summer green, mist-wreathed mountains, mountains whose dry, sharp outline was cut out against a deep blue sky, these apparently under the influence of Segantini. Then there were cowherds' huts, and dewlapped cattle standing or lying in sun-drenched high pastures. There was a plucked fowl, with its long rit-hen neck hanging down from a table among a setting of vegetables. There were flower pieces, types of mountain peasantry, and so on, all painted with a certain brisk dilettantism, the colors boldly dashed onto the canvas, and often looking as though they had been squeezed on out of the tube. They must have taken a long time to dry, but were sometimes effective by way of helping out the other shortcomings. They passed as they would along the walls of an exhibition, accompanied by the master of the house, who now and then gave a name to some subject or other, but was chiefly silent, with the proud embarrassment of the artist, tasting the enjoyment of looking on his own works with the eyes of strangers. The portrait of Claudia Chauchat hung on the window wall of the living room. Hans Castorp spied it out with a quick glance as he entered, though the likeness was but a distant one. Purposely he avoided the spot, detaining his companions in the dining room, where he affected to admire a fresh green glimpse into the valley of the Surbai, with ice-blue glaciers in the background. Next he passed of his own accord into the Turkish cabinet, and looked at all it had to show, with praises on his lips, thence back to the living room, beginning with the entrance wall, and calling upon Joachim to second his encomiums. But at last he turned, with a measured start, and said, "But surely that is a familiar face? You recognize her?" The Hofrat wanted to know. "It is not possible I am mistaken. The lady at the good Russian table, with the French name." "Right. Chauchat. Glad you think it's like her." Speaking, Hans Castorp lied. He did so less from insincerity than in the consciousness that, on the face of things, he ought not to have been able to recognize her. Joachim could never have done so. Good Joachim, who saw the whole affair now in its true light, after the false one Hans Castorp had first cast upon it, saw how the wool had been pulled over his eyes, and with a murmured recognition applied himself to help look at the painting. His cousin had paid him out for not going into society after luncheon. It was a bust-length, in half-profile, rather under life-size, in a wide, beveled frame, black, with an inner beading of gilt. Neck and bosom were bare or veiled with a soft drapery laid about the shoulders. Frau Chauchat appeared 10 years older than her age, As often happens in amateur portraiture, where the artist is bent on making a character study, there was too much red all over the face. The nose was badly out of drawing, the color of the hair badly hit off, too straw color. The mouth was distorted, the peculiar charm of the features ungrasped or at least not brought out, spoiled by the exaggeration of their single elements. The whole was a rather botched performance, and only distantly related to its original. But Hans Castorp was not particular about the degree of likeness. The relation of this canvas to Frau Chauchat's person was close enough for him. It purported to represent her. In these very rooms she had sat for it. That was all he needed. Much moved, he reiterated. The very image of her. Oh, no, the Hofrat demurred. It was a pretty clumsy piece of work. I don't flatter myself I hit her off very well, though we had, I suppose, 20 sittings. What can you do with a sort of face like that? You might think she would be easy to capture, with those Hyperborean cheekbones, and eyes like cracks in a loaf of bread. Yes, there's something about her if you get the detail right. You botched the ensemble. Riddle of the Sphinx. Do you know her? It would probably be better to paint her from memory, instead of having her sit. Did you say you knew her? No. That is, only superficially, the way one knows people up here. Well, I know her under her skin subcutaneously, you see. Blood pressure, tissue tension, lymphatic circulation, all that sort of thing. I've good reason to. It's the superficies makes the difficulty. Have you ever noticed her walk? She slinks. Its characteristic shows in her face. Take the eyes, for example, not to mention the complexion, though that is tricky too. I don't mean their color. I am speaking of the cut and the way they sit in the face. You'd say the eye slit was cut obliquely, but it only looks so. What deceives you is the epicanthus, or racial variation, consisting in a sort of ridge of integument that runs from the bridge of the nose to the eyelid and comes down over the inside corner of the eye. If you take your finger and stretch the skin at the base of the nose, the eye looks as straight as any of ours. Quite a taking little dodge, but as a matter of fact, the epicanthus can be traced back to an atavistic vestige. It's a developmental arrest. So that's it. Hans Castorp said. I never knew that, but I've wondered for a long time what it is about eyes like that. Vanity, said the Hofrat, and vexation of spirit. If you simply draw them in slanting, you are lost. You must bring about the obliquity the same way nature does. You must add illusion to illusion, and for that you have to know about the epicanthus. What a man knows always comes in handy. Now look at the skin, the epidermis. Do you find I've managed to make it lifelike or not? Enormously, said Hans Castorp. Simply enormously. I've never seen skin painted anything like so well. You can fairly see the pores. And he ran the edge of his hand lightly over the bare neck and shoulders, the skin of which, especially by contrast with the exaggerated red of the face, was very white, as though seldom exposed. Whether this effect was premeditated or not, it was rather suggestive. And still Hans Castorp's praise was deserved. The pale shimmer of this tender, though not emaciated, bosom, losing itself in the bluish shadows of the drapery, was very like life. It was obviously painted with feeling, a sort of sweetness emanated from it, yet the artist had been successful in giving it a scientific realism and precision as well. The roughness of the canvas texture, showing through the paint, had been dexterously employed to suggest the natural unevennesses of the skin, this especially in the neighborhood of the delicate collarbones. A tiny mole, at the point where the breasts began to divide, had been done with care, and on their rounding surfaces one thought to trace the delicate blue veins. It was as though a scarcely perceptible shiver of sensibility beneath the eye of the beholder were passing over this nude flesh, as though one might see the perspiration, the invisible vapor which the life beneath threw off, as though, were one to press one's lips upon the surface, one might perceive, not the smell of paint and fixative, but the odor of the human body. Such, at least, were Hans Castorp's impressions, which we here reproduce, and he, of course, was in a peculiarly susceptible state. But it is nonetheless true that Frau Chauchat's portrait was by far the most telling piece of painting in the room. Hofrat Behrens rocked back and forth on his heels and the balls of his feet, his hands in his trouser pockets, as he gazed at his work in company with the cousins. Delighted, he said. Delighted to find favor in the eyes of a colleague. If a man knows a bit about what goes on under the epidermis, that does no harm either. In other words, if he can paint a little below the surface and stands in another relation to nature than just the lyrical, so to say. An artist who is a doctor, physiologist, and anatomist on the side, and has his own little way of thinking about the undersides of things. It all comes in handy too. It gives you the paw. Say what you like. That birthday suit there is painted with science. It is organically correct. You can examine it under the microscope. You can see not only the horny and mucous strata of the epidermis, but I've suggested the texture of the corium underneath, with the oil and sweat glands, the blood vessels and tubercles, and then under that still the layer of fat, the upholstering, full of oil ducts, the underpinning of the lovely female form. What is in your mind as you work runs into your hand and has its influence. It isn't really there, and yet somehow or other it is, and that is what gives the lifelike effect. All this was fuel to Hans Castorp's fire. His brow was flushed, his eyes fairly sparkled. He had so much to say he knew not where to begin. In the first place, he had it in mind to remove the picture of Frau Chauchat from the window wall, where it hung somewhat in shadow, and place it to better advantage. Next, he was eager to take up the Hofrat's remarks about the constitution of the skin, which had keenly interested him, and finally, he wanted to make some remarks of his own, of a general and philosophical nature, which interested him no less mightily. Laying his hands upon the painting to unhook it, he eagerly began. Yes, indeed, that is all very important. What I'd like to say is, you said her Hofrat, if I understood rightly, you said, in another relation. You said it was good when there was some other relation besides the lyric. I think that was the word you used, the artistic, that is, in short, when one looked at the thing from another point of view, the medical, for example. That's all so enormously to the point. I do beg your pardon, her Hofrat, but what I mean is that it is so exactly and precisely right, because after all it is not a question of any fundamentally different relations or points of view, but at bottom just variations of one and the same, just shadings of it. So to speak, variations of one and the same universal interest, the artistic impulse itself being a part, and a manifestation of it too, if I may say so. Yes, if you will pardon me, I will take down this picture. There's positively no light here where it hangs. Permit me to carry it over to the sofa. We shall see if it won't look entirely. What I meant to say was, what is the main concern of the study of medicine? I know nothing about it, of course. But after all, isn't its main concern with human beings? And jurisprudence, making laws, pronouncing judgment, its main concern is with human beings too. And philology, which is nearly always bound up with the profession of pedagogy. And theology, with the care of souls, the office of spiritual shepherd? All of them have to do with human beings. All of them are degrees of one and the same important, the same fundamental interest, the interest in humanity. In other words, they are the humanistic callings, and if you go in for them you have to study the ancient languages by way of foundation, for the sake of formal training, as they say. Perhaps you are surprised at my talking about them like that, being only a practical man and on the technical side. But I have been thinking about these questions lately in the rest cure, and I find it wonderful. I find it a simply priceless arrangement of things, that the formal, the idea of form, of beautiful form, lies at the bottom of every sort of humanistic calling. It gives it such nobility, I think, such a sort of disinterestedness and feeling, too, and courtliness. It makes a kind of chivalrous adventure out of it. That is to say, I suppose I am expressing myself very ridiculously, but you can see how the things of the mind and the love of beauty come together, and that they always really have been one and the same, in other words, science and art, and that the calling of being an artist surely belongs with the others as a sort of fifth faculty, because it too is a humanistic calling, a variety of humanistic interest. In so far as its most important theme or concern is with man, you will agree with me on that point. When I experimented in that line in my youth, I never painted anything but ships and water, of course. But notwithstanding, in my eyes the most interesting branch of painting is, and remains, portraiture, because it has man for its immediate object. That was why I asked at once if you had done anything in that field. Wouldn't this be a far more favorable place for it to hang? Both of them, barons no less than Joachim, looked at him amazed. Was he not ashamed of this confused, impromptu harangue? But no, Hans Castorp was far too preoccupied to feel self-conscious. He held the painting against the sofa wall, and demanded to know if it did not get a much better light. Just then the servant brought a tray, with hot water, a spirit lamp, and coffee cups. Behrens motioned them into the cabinet, saying, "Then you must have been more interested in sculpture, originally, than in painting, I should think." "Yes, of course, it gets more light there, if you think it can stand it." "I should suppose so, because sculpture concerns itself more purely and exclusively with the human form. But we mustn't let the water boil away." "Quite right, sculpture," Hans Castorp said as they went. He forgot either to hang up or put down the picture he had been holding, but tugged it with him into the neighboring room. Certainly a Greek Venus or athlete is more humanistic. It is probably at bottom the most humanistic of all the arts when one comes to think about it. Well, as far as little Chow Chat goes, she is a better subject for painting than sculpture. Phidias, or that other chap with the mosaic ending to his name, would have stuck up their noses at her style of physiognomy. "Hello, where are you going with the ham?" "Pardon me, I'll just lean it here against the leg of my chair. That will do very well for the moment." The Greek sculptors did not trouble themselves about the head and face. Their interest was more with the body. I suppose that was their humanism, and the plasticity of the female form. "So that is fat, is it?" "That is fat," the Hofrat said concisely. He had opened a hanging cabinet and taken thence the requisites for his coffee-making, a cylindrical Turkish mill, a long-handled pot, a double receptacle for sugar and ground coffee, all in brass. "Palmidin, stearin, olein," he went on, shaking the coffee berries from a tin box into the mill, which he began to turn. "You see, I make it all myself. It tastes twice as good. Did you think it was ambrosia?" "No, of course I knew. Only it sounds strange to hear it like that," Hans Castorp said. They were seated in the corner between door and window, at a bamboo taboret which held an oriental brass tray, upon which Behrens had set the coffee machine, among the smoking utensils. Joachim was next Behrens on the ottoman, overflowing with cushions. Hans Castorp sat in a leather armchair on casters, against which he had leaned Frau Chauchat's picture. A gaily colored carpet was beneath their feet. The Hofrat ladled coffee and sugar into the long-handled pot, added water, and let the brew boil up over the flame of the lamp. It foamed brownly in the little onion-patterned cups and proved on tasting both strong and sweet. "Your own as well," Behrens said. "Your plasticity, so far as you have any, is fat too, though of course not to the same extent as with a woman. With us fat is only about 5% of the body weight. In females it is 1/16 of the whole. Without that subcutaneous cell structure of ours, we should all be nothing but fungoid growths. It disappears, with time, and then come the unersthetic wrinkles in the drapery. The layer is thickest on the female breast and belly, on the front of the thighs, everywhere, in short, where there is a little something for heart and hand to take hold of. The soles of the feet are fat and ticklish." Hans Castorp turned the cylindrical coffee mill about in his hands. It was, like the rest of the set, Indian or Persian rather than Turkish. The style of the engraving showed that, with the bright surface of the pattern standing out against the purposely dulled background. He looked at the design, without immediately seeing what it was. When he did, he blushed unawares. "Yes, that is a set for single gentlemen," Behrens said. "I keep it locked up, you see, my kitchen queen might hurt her eyes looking at it. It won't you gentlemen any harm, I take it. It was given to me by a patient, an Egyptian princess who once honored us with a year or so of her presence. You see, the pattern repeats itself on the whole set. Pretty roguish, what?" "Yes, it is quite unusual," Hans Castorp answered. "Ha ha. No, it doesn't trouble me. But one can take it perfectly seriously, solemnly, in fact. Only then it is rather out of place on a coffee machine. The ancients are said to have used such motifs on their sarcophagi. The sacred and the obscene were more or less the same thing to them." "I should say the princess was more for the second," Behrens said. "Anyhow, she still sends me the most wonderful cigarettes, superfinissimos, you know, only sported on first-class occasions." He fetched the garish-colored box from the cupboard and offered them. Joachim drew his heels together as he received his cigarette. Hans Castorp helped himself to his. It was unusually large and thick, and had a gilt sphinx on it. He began to smoke. It was wonderful, as Behrens had said. "Tell us some more about the skin," he begged the Hofrat. "That is, if you will be so kind." He had taken Frau Chauchat's portrait on his knee and was gazing at it, leaning back in his chair, the cigarette between his lips. Not about the fat layer, we know about that now. About the human skin in general that you know so well how to paint. About the skin. You're interested in physiology? Very much. Yes, I've always felt a good deal of interest in it. The human body, yes, I've always had an uncommon turn for it. I've sometimes asked myself whether I ought not to have been a physician. It wouldn't have been a bad idea, in a way. Because if you are interested in the body, you must be interested in disease, specially interested, isn't that so? But it doesn't signify. I might have been such a lot of things, for example, a clergyman. Indeed. Yes, I've sometimes had the idea I should have been decidedly in my element there. How did you come to be an engineer, then? I just happened to. It was more or less outward circumstances that decided the matter. Well, about the skin. What do you want to hear about your sensory sheath? You know, don't you, that it is your outside brain, ontogenetically the same as that apparatus of the so-called higher centers up there in your cranium? The central nervous system is nothing but a modification of the outer skin layer. Among the lower animals, the distinction between central and peripheral doesn't exist. They smell and taste with their skin. It is the only sensory organ they have. Must be rather nice if you can put yourself in their place. On the other hand, in such highly differentiated forms of life as you and I are, the skin has fallen from its high estate. It has to confine itself to feeling ticklish. That is to say, to being simply a protective and registering apparatus, but devilishly on the qui-vive for anything that tries to come too close about the body. It even puts out feelers, the body hairs, which are nothing but hardened skin cells, and they get wind of the approach of whatever it is, before the skin itself is touched. Just between ourselves, it is quite possible that this protecting and defending function of the skin extends beyond the physical. Do you know what makes you go red and pale? Not very precisely. Well, neither do we, very precisely, to be frank, at least as far as blushing is concerned. The situation is not quite clear, for the dilatory muscles which are presumably set in action by the vasomotor nerves haven't yet been demonstrated in relation to the blood vessels. How the cock really swells his comb, or any of the other well-known instances come about, is still a mystery, particularly where it is a question of emotional influences in play. We assume that a connection subsists between the outer rind of the cerebrum and the vascular center in the medulla. Certain stimuli, for instance, let's say, like you're being powerfully embarrassed, set up the connection, and the nerves that control the blood vessels function toward the face, and they expand and fill, and you get a face like a turkey cock, all swelled up with blood, so you can't see out of your eyes. On the other hand, suppose you are in suspense, something is going to happen. It may be something tremendously beautiful. For aught I care, the blood vessels that feed the skin contract. It gets pale and cold and sunken. You look like a dead man, with big, lead-colored eye sockets and a peaked nose. But the sympathicus makes your heart thump away like a good fellow. So that is how it happens, Hans Castorp said. Something like that. Those are reactions, you know. But it is the nature of reactions and reflexes to have a reason for happening. We are beginning to suspect, we physiologists, that the phenomena accompanying emotion are really defense mechanisms, protective reflexes of a system.
Gooseflesh, now.
Do you know how you come to have gooseflesh? Not very clearly either, I'm afraid. That is a little contrivance of the sebaceous glands, which secrete the fatty, albuminous substance that oils your skin and keeps it supple and pleasant to feel of. Not very appetizing, maybe, but without it the skin would be all withered and cracked. Without the cholesterol, it is hard to imagine touching the human skin at all. These sebaceous glands have little erector muscles that act upon them, and when they do so, then you are like the lad when the princess poured the pail of minnows over him. Your skin gets like a file, and if the stimulus is very powerful, the hair ducts are erected too. The hair on your head bristles up and the little hairs on your body, like quills upon the fretful porcupine. And you can say, like the youth in the story, that now you know how to shiver and shake. Oh, said Hans Castorp, I know how already. I shiver rather easily, on all sorts of provocation. Only what surprises me is that the glands are erected for such different reasons. It gives one gooseflesh to hear a slate pencil run across a pane of glass, but when you hear particularly beautiful music you suddenly find you have it too, and when I was confirmed and took my first communion, I had one shiver after another. It seemed as though the prickling and stickling would never leave off. Imagine those little muscles acting for such different reasons. Oh, Behrens said, tickling. The body doesn't give a hang for the content of the stimulus. It may be minnows. It may be the Holy Ghost. The sebaceous glands are erected just the same. Hans Castorp regarded the picture on his knee. Herr Hofrat, he said, I wanted to come back to something you said a moment ago, about internal processes, lymphatic action, and that sort of thing. Tell us about it, particularly about the lymphatic system. It interests me tremendously. I believe you, Behrens responded. The lymph is the most refined, the most rarefied, the most intimate of the body juices. I dare say you had an inkling of the fact in your mind when you asked. People talk about the blood and the mysteries of its composition and what an extraordinary fluid it is. But it is the lymph that is the juice of juices, the very essence, you understand, ichor, blood milk, creme de la creme. As a matter of fact, after a fatty diet it does look like milk. And he went on, in his lively and whimsical phraseology, to gratify Hans Castorp's desire. And first he characterized the blood, a serum composed of fat, albumin, iron, sugar, and salt, crimson as an opera cloak, the product of respiration and digestion, saturated with gases, laden with waste products, which was pumped at 98.4 degrees of heat from the heart through the blood vessels and kept up metabolism and animal warmth throughout the body. In other words, sweet life itself. But, he said, the blood did not come into immediate contact with the body cells. What happened was that the pressure at which it was pumped caused a milky extract of it to sweat through the walls of the blood vessels and so into the tissues, so that it filled every tiny interstice and cranny and caused the elastic cell tissue to distend. This distension of the tissues, or turgor, pressed the lymph, after it had nicely swillied out the cells and exchanged matter with them, into the vasa lymphatica, the lymphatic vessels, and so back into the blood again, at the rate of 1.5 liters a day. He went on to speak of the lymphatic tubes and absorbent vessels, described the secretion of the breast milk, which collected lymph from legs, abdomen, and breast, one arm, and one side of the head, described the very delicately constructed filters called lymphatic glands which were placed at certain points in the lymphatic system, in the neck, the armpit, and the elbow joint, the hollow under the knee, and other soft and intimate parts of the body. Swellings may occur in these places, Behrens explained. Indurations of the lymphatic glands, let us say in the knee pan or the arm joint, dropsical tumors here and there, and we base our diagnosis on them. They always have a reason, though not always a very pretty one. Under such circumstances, there is more than a suspicion of tubercular congestion of the lymphatic vessels. Hans Castorp was silent a little space. Yes, he said then in a low voice, it is true, I might very well have been a doctor. The flow of the breast milk, the lymph of the legs, all that interests me very, very much. What is the body? He rhapsodically burst forth. What is the flesh? What is the physical being of man? What is he made of? Tell us this afternoon, Hofrat. Tell us exactly, and once and for all, so that we may know. Of water, answered Behrens. So, you are interested in organic chemistry too? The human body consists, much the larger part of it, of water. No more and no less than water, and nothing to get wrought up about. The solid parts are only 25% of the whole, and of that 20 are ordinary white of egg, protein if you want to use a handsomer word. Besides that, a little fat and a little salt, that's about all. But the white of egg, what is that? Various primary substances: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, sometimes phosphorus. Your scientific curiosity is running away with itself. Some albumins are in composition with carbohydrates, that is to say, grape sugar and starch. In old age, the flesh becomes tough. That is because the collagen increases in the connective tissue, the lime, the most important constituent of the bones and cartilage. What else shall I tell you? In the muscle plasma, we have an albumin called fibrin. When death occurs, it coagulates in the muscular tissue and causes the rigor mortis. Right-o, I see. The rigor mortis, Hans Castorp said blithely. Very good, very good. And then comes the general analysis, the anatomy of the grave. Yes, of course. But how well you put it. Yes, the movement becomes general. You flow away, so to speak, remember all that water. The remaining constituents are very unstable. Without life, they are resolved by putrefaction into simpler combinations and organic. Dissolution, putrefaction, said Hans Castorp. They are the same thing as combustion, combination with oxygen, am I right? To AT, oxidization. And life. Oxidization too.
The same.
Yes, young man, life too is principally oxidization of the cellular albumin, which gives us that beautiful animal warmth, of which we sometimes have more than we need. Tut, living consists in dying, no use mincing the matter. En destruction organique, as some Frenchman with his native levity has called it. It smells like that too. If we don't think so, our judgment is corrupted. And if one is interested in life, one must be particularly interested in death, mustn't one? Oh, well, after all, there is some sort of difference. Life is life, which keeps the form through change of substance. Why should the form remain? Said Hans Castorp.
Why?
Young man, what you are saying now sounds far from humanistic. Form is falderall. Well, you are certainly in great form today. You're regularly kicking over the traces. But I must drop out now, said the Hofrat. I am beginning to feel melancholy, and he laid his huge hand over his eyes. I can feel it coming on. You see, I've drunk coffee with you, and it tasted good to me, and all of a sudden it comes over me that I am going to be melancholy. You gentlemen must excuse me. It was an extra occasion. I enjoyed it no end. The cousins had sprung up. They reproached themselves for having taxed the Hofrat's patience so long. He made proper protest. Hans Castorp hastened to carry Frau Chauchat's portrait into the next room and hang it once more on the wall. They did not need to retraverse the garden to arrive at their own quarters. Behrens directed them through the building and accompanied them to the dividing glass door. In the mood that had come over him so unexpectedly, his goggling eyes blinked, and the bone of his neck stuck out, both more than ever. His upper lip, with the clipped, one-sided mustache, had taken on a querulous expression. As they went along the corridors, Hans Castorp said to his cousin, "Confess that it was a good idea of mine." "It was a change, at least," responded Joachim. "And you certainly took occasion to air your views on a good many subjects. It was a bit complicated for me. It is high time now that we went into the rest cure. We shall have at least 20 minutes before tea. You probably think it is falderall to pay so much attention to it. Now you've taken to kicking over the traces. But you don't need it so much as I do, after all.